Let me check. Let's put the link in the bottom. I can share it out a bit. Okay. So, hello everybody, and welcome to just an impromptu thing. Jesusis Lord and I have, been talking about doing this for a while. He says there are no contradictions in the Bible. I think he's quite wrong, and I think I can demonstrate it as well. So, I'm looking to do that. Do you want to say hello?
Hey everybody, how's it going? It's good to be here on Mr. Cliffhanger's channel.
Cliff Jumper.
And Cliffhanger was one of my favorite cartoon characters, by the way.
Cliff Jumper.
Cliff Jumper. Cliff Jumper. Was there a Cliffhanger also?
Cliffhanger's the one with Stallone.
Okay. See, I knew there was a Cliffhanger and a Cliff Jumper.
Yeah. So well, there wasn't a Transformer called Cliffhanger, not that I'm aware of, anyway.
You didn't watch Transformers?
Well, yeah, I watched it a lot. I've got all of them on DVD over there. But
yeah, I still have all 5 seasons, all the original.
Yeah, me too. You know, I got some of the original toys. I grew up with it.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Transformers and Lego. Those were the toys.
All right. Well, contradictions in the Bible. You said you found some. I've found none. So anytime someone has found something in Scripture that I'm not aware of, I'm always interested in hearing more.
Okay, cool.
So let's go. What have you found?
Yeah. Okay. So let me chuck in. I'll screen share because it's easier to screen share. Now, are you okay with the New King James Version? It just gets rid of the fake 15th century floral style. So,
I'm okay with any version except for the New World Translation. The New World Translation is wrong.
Is it the Mormons one or is that the
that's Jehovah's Witness?
Yeah. Jehovah's Witnesses always confuse me because according to their position, there's like 100,000 seats on the bus or whatever the number was, and yet they're standing on the street trying to get people to join their club, which means that they might be denying their own seat on the bus. Just seems a bit irritating to me. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, okay, so my main one where you can definitely see the contradictions are in the resurrection accounts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when you look at them, there are multiple contradictions. None of them say exactly the same thing. And, you know, it's quite clear that there are contradictions. Now,
okay,
you know, this, you know, let me just screen share. So I'll screen share for you. Can you just make sure you can see my screen share?
Yeah, see it perfectly. Well, let me ask you a question, Cliff, before you get started there. Can you define contradiction for the audience?
Yeah, something that doesn't coincide with another aspect. You know, so
okay. Well, based on,
for example, is how many angels were in the tomb? Was it 1 or 2? Because they can't both be true at the same time.
Okay. All right. Well, if that's your definition of contradiction, then I would say you're correct. That I don't hold to that. I don't think that definition is suitable if you're going to be discussing a text that are written by different authors at different times. So they're not all going to say the same thing or coincide, basically.
Yeah, but you know, I mean, we're not talking about you know, obscure things here. We're talking about very specific things. You know, effectively 4 people talking about the same event, but telling very different versions of it.
Well, sure. And I had this same discussion with I think it was a guy by the name of Deconverted Man. I don't know if you're familiar with
I know
his channel, or basically a contradiction. The true definition, not that your definition isn't good, but I don't think it's a complete definition. The contradiction, there has to be a denial of X. Okay, so there has to be a denial. If I say you went to the store, the contradiction would have to be you did not go to the store. So it has to be a negation of P, or whatever letter you want to use.
Okay.
All right. So for one author to say that there were two angels and another author to say that there was one is not a contradiction.
Well, which one's true?
Well, where there are two angels, there's always one.
Yeah, but that doesn't mention the other one. You if you're going to go with that, then you're going to go into eisegesis here, because you're basically adding to something that isn't there.
Well, let me put it this way. Okay. The two accounts, I think you're referring to Matthew, and then Luke has a second account. Is that correct, or is it Mark or
Mark and Luke?
Okay, yeah, Mark. So Mark says there was one angel, or two. Mark says there were two. Matthew. Well, go ahead and read the passage for everyone so that they know what we're referring to here. Because
16:5. Okay, so let me shut that one in. Sort of red. And Luke 24:4. Now, it doesn't actually say angels, of course. It says people in men in white garments, but there is, they're traditionally, referred to as being angels. I apologize for the ambulance in the background there. So, so if we look, we've got Mark here, which says there are a young man clothed in one long white robe sitting on the right side. And then on Luke, there are two standing. So one man sitting or two men standing.
Okay. So Luke says there were two men standing, and Mark says that there was just one.
Yep. Which one's true?
Well, as I said, where there are two angels, there's always one. Now, I think the problem is with the definition of contradiction. I don't think the classic definition of contradiction is just simply or merely two things that don't match up. I can't remember the exact words that you used, but I don't want to misquote you.
I'll go with the the proper definition: a combination of statements, ideas, or features which are opposed to one another. Well, certainly in terms of features, this would be a contradiction. So that's the first version. A situation in which inconsistent elements are present, also this version. The statement of position opposite of one already made, which is the one you were referencing there. So went to the store, didn't go to the store.
Okay, so there you have a negation. You have a negation of don't or didn't. I don't see that negation there. I don't see Mark saying there was only one angel. Now, he describes the one angel, perhaps because from his perspective, that was the one. Remember, I think the text says that angel was glowing, a certain type of glow. So maybe his perspective was only and maybe the other angel looked more human-like. Maybe he just decided to write on the one angel. Okay. That's not a contradiction.
Well,
a contradiction would
a
contradiction would say,
sorry about
there was only one angel.
Okay.
Okay. And then another place it says there were two angels. That is a contradiction by definition, by the classical sense of the word.
But why would you say only one? It doesn't say there was only one, and it doesn't say there weren't two. But as soon as you start going along that line, you're now going to exegesis. You're adding to what the Bible says as opposed to what it actually says.
Well, what I'm saying is that it does not say there was only one angel. It just simply talks about the one angel. It doesn't say there was only one angel here at the tomb. Mark just decides to discuss the one angel. Let me give you an example of let's just come outside of the Bible for 1 second here, because detectives do this for a living. And right now, if you were to solve a case, I have to say you would be considered a very poor detective.
Okay.
Right. So here's the scenario. There's a bank robbery. Okay. Yep. One witness A, says that the robber had a mask, a gun, and a knife.
Okay.
Okay. Witness B says that the robber had a gun.
Yep.
Okay. You are the detective trying to solve this case. Does witness A contradict witness B?
Well, yes, I mean they do, but of course, you know, you draw your general consistency. I don't know why I've got to.
Does witness A contradict witness B based on the classical definition of a logical contradiction, where there's a denial of witness A from witness B?
Well, no, it's. I mean, you know, there was still a robber. They've just got the details wrong.
No, none of them got the details wrong. They just gave different details.
That's right. So,
and some of the details were the same.
Yeah.
And some were omitted. Omissions are not contradictions.
Yeah, but as soon as you start, but when you start looking at the Bible with this, do you believe the Bible is inerrant?
Yes.
It's without error. So if it's without error, then one says one thing and one says another. They can't be without error and have errors between them at the same time. This is the law of non-contradiction.
Okay. Well, my definition of inerrant, we need to define that, because the Bible does contain, you know, of course, scribal errors. Okay. So when people were copying, because the Bible was one of the few religions, if not the only religion, that was kept out of the hand exclusively of any apostolic power or any church authority, meaning normal people were copying these things down and passing them around, not professional scribes.
Well,
there were some minor errors in spelling and grammar.
Well, I hate to point this out, but all this stuff that I've got here was written by professional scribers. You know, it's Greek. It's written in Greek rhetoric, which is a style of writing, a style of prose. This is the kind of stuff that would have been written in Alexandria or something like that. You know, these were professional writers.
Every line of transmission was done by a professional scribe. You have proof of that?
Well, yeah. I mean, who else would have done this? Do you think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote these things? You know, do you think that this Matthew that I've got on the screen here is one of the apostles?
I think that they did. They may have hired scribes, but what I'm saying is over the transmission of the text from when they started writing or hiring scribes to write and copying, from that time, 2,000 years, not everyone that made a copy was a professional scribe. And even the professional scribes make errors. Even the professionals make spelling and grammar errors. I make spelling errors, and I make grammatical errors.
Right.
So those types of errors are found in the text, but they're easily corrected by the science of textual criticism. Textual critics have resolved most, if not all, of those spelling and small errors.
I need you to get a quick, got a bearing on. Who do you think that the Matthew here is one of the apostles?
Sure, he's one of the 12, yes.
The person who wrote this.
Okay. Yes.
Why?
Because that's what tradition has taught.
Okay, what about Mark? Do you think that was written by the Apostle Mark? Sorry about that.
I think Mark wrote Mark, and whether they wrote it after dictating to a scribe. I think Mark was wrote as Peter dictated, is what the tradition holds.
Yeah, you know that Mark wasn't an apostle, right?
No, he wrote. He might have been a scribe. He might have been hired by the apostles to write Mark.
But he wasn't one of the apostles. Mark was not an apostle.
No. But Peter was. Peter is the one who.
Let me just clarify. You said no. I'm not sure what you're knowing to. Are you saying no?
No, Mark was not an apostle. He wrote as Peter dictated to him. Okay. So it's called the Gospel according to Mark, but it's really Peter. Okay. It's really Peter's.
I just want to make sure that, because I don't want to straw man you. Obviously, that wouldn't be fair.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to the contradiction, because I think we're going off into a rabbit hole here.
Well, you were saying about how the bank robber and you get multiple.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Same story. Yeah, let me get back to the bank robber, witness A and witness B. Based on the true definition of a contradiction, as far as a logical definition of logic, the conjunction of a statement or the denial of a statement, or not P or whatever you want to use here. The contradiction would be witness A says he did not have a mask, for example, or he did not have a knife. Now you have to. Now, the reason why. Now, a good detective will say, well, why did witness B only mention the gun? Well, there could be several reasons why witness B only mentions the gun. It could be she had tunnel vision. You get a gun pulled out on you. Police officers say you have tunnel vision. That's all you see is the gun. Okay. Maybe witness A was from the hood, and she's used to seeing people pull out guns all the time, so she was able to factor in everything else that was going on around her. Okay. So that's not a contradiction, and neither is the two angels and then the one angel at the tomb. We see here's Matthew, which goes bonkers. I mean, to use your analogy, there's a bank robbery, and there are the robber is tall in Mark 16, or he's got in Mark, and he's short, he's fat. Let's go fat and thin. Okay, let's say in Mark he's a fat guy, a fat robber, and in Luke he's a thin robber, and in Matthew he's Big Bird from Sesame Street. Because if you look, and I'm basically reductio ad absurdum there. There's a big difference between, oh look, the tomb's already open, and the tomb, because Mark and Luke say it was already open when they got there. Whereas Matthew says there's a great earthquake that only one of them mention, and an angel swoops out of the sky and moves the tombstone out of the way in front of them. Is this another contradiction, or are we still talking about how many angels were at the tomb?
Well, I mean, in this version, there's only one angel, but the angel isn't inside; he's outside, and swoops out of the sky with an earthquake. Okay, so it appears as though Matthew, when he decided to write, remember, these are writers that are not in the same room with each other. Mm-hmm. They're not writing at the same time, even decade. Even secular scholars would, or liberal scholars would agree they were not writing at the same time in the same place. So the details are going to be different. Perhaps Matthew wanted to concentrate on the angel who did move the rock, and doesn't mention that, he just omits the other angel. The omission of a fact or a detail is not a contradiction. It's not contradicting. Remember, witness A did not contradict witness B because she omitted the ski mask and the knife. But here, this is where the contradiction comes in, Because
that's not a contradiction. That's an omission of a detail.
Allow me to illustrate. Okay, so in Mark, they turn up and it's who's going to who's going to roll away the tombstone for us, and then in Luke, the tombstone is already rolled away, and then in Matthew, an angel turns up and moves the tombstone out of the way in front of them. They're there. They can see the tomb, and look, an angel pops up out of nowhere.
I think I've seen. I don't have the information on me, but I'm glad to send it to you. I've seen someone reconcile those three accounts in a timeline sort of format, so that you could see that yes, these things don't contradict. They're just telling the story from a different perspective. So Matthew may not start his story in the beginning. He may start it in the middle and then go all the way to the end. Mark may start his story in the beginning and go halfway. So you can reconcile, sort of like putting the pieces of a puzzle together. That's why they're called the Synoptic Gospels. Okay, you put them all together to flush out the entire story. And when you do that, you recognize that they don't contradict, they actually complement each other.
Well, they only complement each other if one is not true and another one is true. On one,
but it's not. But there is no negation here. See, what you're doing is you're showing me details, different details of the same event. There's no negation of P. You need a negation. You need the text to say there was no angel at the tomb, and then you need another text to say there was an angel at the tomb. See the negation there. There's no negation in your example here.
But you're using one version of contradiction. I'm using another. I mean, I think this is the major difficulty we're having here. Because for me, the details are what matter. I mean, this is an important factor to realize. We're not talking about some report about a bank robbery here. We're talking about the most important event in all humanity from your theological perspective.
Yeah, I agree. But I disagree on the notion that because this is an important book, that it cannot be written in a synoptic fashion. The four gospels are not carbon copies. They were not intended to be carbon copies. Now, had they intended to be carbon copies and we had this problem, I would agree with you wholeheartedly. But they were not intended. Like, if you're writing a story about 9/11, your story is not going to say the same thing that somebody that was in Tower A perspective is going to say. True or false?
Yeah, but hang on, there's a difference there, though. Because if you're in Tower 1 and they're in Tower 2, you're not going to be able to say the same thing. But according to this story, these are four people at the same place at the same time, seeing the same thing, but all getting the details wrong or incorrect.
They're not wrong. So you're assuming that they're wrong because they're different. Well, wrong does not mean different does not equate to wrong. You can give different details as long as there is something to connect it. Like, I may be in Tower A, and I actually use this another example in my conversation with the Converted Man. Okay. In Tower A, you may not see the sirens. In Tower B, I may see the sirens coming down the street or coming down whatever street that's Fifth Avenue, I'm not sure, but okay. I may see that from my perspective. I'm not contradicting my fellow reporter. I'm giving different details of the same event. Okay. That when you put them all together, yes, there were sirens, and then you put the details together, you flush out the entire story. That's all I'm saying. I watch all news channels because I want the whole story. I watch every news channel I can get my hand on. Because I know one news channel is not going to give me all the information that happened for a particular event.
Yeah, it depends on the reporters at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps. Well, we have some bias there if you're watching CNN, but
or who they've been. The difficulty I have here is that how are you able to define which is the accurate one, which isn't?
They're all accurate. They're just different perspectives.
But which detail is right and which detail's not right?
All of the details are right. They'd never contradict.
They can't all be right at the same time.
Where there are two angels, there is always one. Where there is a mask, a gun, and a knife, there is always a gun. That is not a contradiction. That is a omission. For whatever reason, Matthew decided not to mention the other angel.
Okay,
now, if he had said there was only one angel, then you would have a contradiction by definition of the word.
Okay, so was there an earthquake?
Yes.
Well, how do you know that? How do you know that?
Based on Matthew's report.
And what about the other ones? Are they wrong then?
No, they just omitted that.
So because they omitted it despite being there,
they chose not to write about that.
Oh,
that
sorry,
wasn't important. Okay, let me.
Sorry, wait a minute. They weren't there, were they?
Sure, they were there. They were eyewitnesses.
How could they be eyewitnesses?
How can they be eyewitnesses? Okay, now we're getting off into.
No. How could they possibly be eyewitnesses when there aren't any? None of them are there. They're the women. The women are there.
Oh, you're talking about the earthquake that I thought you were talking about the earthquake that opened up the grave. Okay.
No, this is just the earthquake with the angel.
Yeah, from the test. Yeah, I would say from the testimony. I thought you were talking about another passage. I'm sorry. From the testimony of the women that came back and told them, I would assume that that's where they got the information from.
Well, you see, that's interesting because there's a slight problem here, and that comes down to towards the end. Let me just find it. Let me highlight them just to make sure you can see them. So 28, 8. That's in yellow, isn't it? So let's make that one. And then John 22. Let's make that green. And then 18. Hang on, that's not right. 8, sorry, not 18. 8. And where was the other one? Luke 24:9. Okay, so with Matthew, the women tell off to tell, to tell the disciples. So, they ran to bring his disciples the word.
Right.
Doesn't mention who they speak to, just, the disciples. Okay, very vague.
Right.
And then
there were only 12.
And then we've got.
I'm sorry.
And then we've got John 2 went to see Simon Peter, and to the other disciple who Jesus loved and said to them, they've taken him away from the tomb. And Peter goes, and the other guy follows. We've got Luke, which is 24:9, which is wait a minute, I got that wrong. Told all the disciples, except for Mary Magdalene, who stood by crying, which is in John. And then she didn't go at all. But then we've got the fun one, which is they told nobody, which is in Mark. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the end from Mark, Mark finishes at verse 8. The resurrection account finishes at verse 8. The textual critics, the end of it is a forgery. It was added much later on. And we have evidence for this as well. Are you familiar with the Codex Sinaiticus?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the scribal edition to the ending of Mark. I have no problem with that.
Yeah. So basically, what for the people watching, there was in the 1800s, the oldest gospel that we have is from the 4th century. The oldest version, copy we have was found at the bottom at St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai in the 1800s. A German guy found it, and it finishes at Mark 8, at Mark 16, verse 8, and then goes straight on to the next section. Okay. Now, if it finishes at Mark 8 and they went out and told nobody, they said nothing to anyone for they were afraid, then, we've now got the Goonies situation. That one can't be right. That one can't be true. They can't have told nobody and told people at the same time. And we do know that Mark was the first of the 4 Gospels written.
Well, there are scholars that are challenging that. That is the traditional view, but there are scholars that are challenging that today based on the new evidence. But so you're saying that this is a contradiction. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, I mean, if Mark is true, then all the other ones are lies because there weren't any eyewitnesses. Effectively, the women fled and told nobody, and so nobody gave the information.
I'm not familiar with that contradiction. I've never heard anyone bring that up. I'd have to look into that one. You're saying that. Let me try to pull up the text here. Now, this is Matthew. Are you reading here, or is this Mark? The ending of Mark.
This is the end of Mark.
Okay, so you're saying the ending of Mark says that what?
Yeah, if we just, I don't know, let's just chuck in. Sorry, wrong version. Let's just chuck in an IV just for random stuff. So if you look, the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 to 20. So all this stuff here has been added on the end at some point.
Okay, so if this was an addition, then why are you bringing up a contradiction if you know it was an addition?
Well, the contradiction is, that it finishes here where they told nobody. And so if this one is true, then all the other ones are lies.
Oh, now wait a minute. I get it now.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Now, you're saying that because the women went out and fled from the tomb, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Yep.
Okay, let me do this. I'm going to look up the definition of synoptic because I think we're missing a central theme here that I don't know if you're ignoring it or you're just ignorant of what the synoptic gospels actually mean. All right, the word synoptic means that you're forming a general summary.
Yeah,
that's what the literal definition is: forming a general summary, right? Or synopsis, right? It's where the word synopsis comes from.
Yes.
So if Mark ends abruptly, and we don't know why he ends abruptly like this, because we know that there's more to the story, that's fine. That's why we have the other gospels to fill in those gaps. So what you have here is an assembly line, not one assembly line trying to put the pieces together, but you have 4 different assembly lines all converging for the entire story.
Okay,
so it doesn't say
Mark's not true then.
No, Mark doesn't tell the whole story.
That's
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell the whole story, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the whole story.
Is Mark correct?
Mark is correct. Yes, they were afraid. They left. They didn't
actually tell nobody then.
When they fled from the tomb, they didn't tell anybody. I wouldn't tell anybody either until I got home. So Matthew picks up the story. Matthew picks up the story.
They said nothing to anyone.
Right.
So
they went out and they fled from the tomb.
Hang on. Did they say something to anyone?
Of course, they said something to their disciples.
So Mark is lying then.
Mark ends abruptly. We see that. The earliest manuscripts and some ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 to 20. This was an addition. Perhaps the rest of the story was not included or could not have been copied for whatever reason. So the scribal insertion is there from other manuscript traditions. That doesn't mean that the story is saying something different. Mark, we know, ends abruptly. So we know that's not the end of the story. Now, had we had the end of the story...
That's the exact negotiation of P.
No, it's not.
Absolutely it is. They said nothing to anyone.
They said nothing to anyone at the point in the story when they fled from the tomb. Read the sentence before. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Right.
That's not the end of the story, sir. Well, then when they got back to the disciples, they then saw Peter. She saw Peter and told him what happened.
According to Mark, not according
to Mark, but according to all of the synoptic gospels when you put them together. Right. I can write a story. Let me just say this. I can write a story, right? And you can finish the story for me, and I can end my story or in my chapter or in my part of the story saying that I was afraid. And then in chapter 2, I may all of a sudden get enough courage to do whatever it is I had to do. That's not a contradiction. That's telling a story and the story progressing. Let the story progress. Here's how we get the entire story. We put all three of the synoptics together to flush out the entire story. We don't try to look for differences or different parts of the story or different parts of the narrative at different points in the narrative and try to make them contradict each other. Let me give you an example of how this can lead to heresy. What you're doing, you're not doing it, not saying you're doing this intentionally, but this is what a lot of people do who want to start religion or want to start cults. They take passages out of the Bible. There's a passage in the Bible where Jesus says, do not go unto the Gentile, right? Now, he says this early on in the Gospels. It may be in one Gospel, it may be in two, it may be in all three. Like I said, different details, same story, different perspectives. Later, towards the end of the book of Matthew, he says, now go to all nations, that includes Gentiles, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, if you were to stop, okay, at the first charge he gives his disciples and try to make it contradict with Matthew, the end of the story, you would, according to your definition, have a contradiction. That is not a contradiction. That is at one point in the story, they were afraid. And then at another point in the story, they told what happened.
Okay, so if that's the case, then this one is wrong.
No, it's not wrong. It's only telling the part of the story when they left and they ran from the tomb. Listen, if I see a ghost, I'm running and I'm not telling anybody and I'm not speaking to anybody because I'm afraid.
Okay, so
they just saw a man. Right? Do you realize what they just saw?
Well,
do you understand what they just saw? Like they didn't see a dog or a pet terrier.
Okay,
they saw a man rise from the dead.
Well, that's not true.
Well, we believe they saw a man rise from the dead. Okay. Of course they were afraid. Of course they ran. Of course they didn't speak to anyone. But when they got to their disciples, to the people that they know that they're comfortable with, They told him. I don't see any problem with that. I don't see any problem with that narrative.
But here's the problem. None of the other ones say that they were afraid and didn't tell anyone and then changed their mind.
That's fine.
So you're adding to the scripture then?
No, I'm not adding to the scripture.
Of course you are.
What I'm doing is I'm combining both accounts.
In order to bridge Mark 16 verse 8, where they run away and tell nobody, and get to the next part where they tell people, you would have to have them changing their mind. And the other ones don't say that at all. They just, they read and they fled and they told people straight away.
They fled. They did not tell anybody on their way home.
That doesn't say that.
It doesn't say it
at all.
I'm telling you what I've done with the text, because they are synoptic, is I combine the stories together. Again, I could give you a detailed, with all of the passages that you're reading, I can give you a timeline, putting verses, compiling verses based on the story and what happened in chronological order, because that's not how it's given to you. That's why it's frustrating. I understand that. It's not given to you in chronological order. It's 3 different accounts. Mark ends abruptly. You agree with that? That's an abrupt ending. What happened after that? It doesn't say.
Here's the problem.
They were afraid. Do you see something wrong with the ending of Mark? It's ended abruptly. We know there's more to the story. We know that's not the end. How do we know that? Because we have the other synoptics.
But the other synoptics are based upon Mark. Mark was written first, and the other authors added stuff in there based upon the Mark story, and they added stuff for different audiences, because one was written for the Jews, one was written for the Gentiles. Like, for example, John is more of a spiritual resurrection rather than a physical one that Matthew has.
I don't know about that, but remember these are different accounts that were written during different times. I can't say which came first. Some people say John. There's evidence that John was written very early, or Matthew rather. So we don't know which one was written.
If I remember correctly, Matthew was the third one. I might be wrong.
Well, it's really difficult to pin down because of the. I can't say it's not trust.
Would you like me to invite Shadow Heathen? He's much more historically aware of the little details in what was written first and things like that.
Well, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. I mean, you can invite him in, but it's irrelevant which was written first. The point I'm making is that these are different accounts. They weren't sitting down copying Mark. Mark wasn't sitting down, or Matthew rather, wasn't copying from Mark. He's just simply telling the story as he remembers it, or as he recalls. He's not sitting there with a pen and paper saying, okay, Mark said this, therefore I got to include this. Or Mark said that, so I have to include that. I don't think that's how it was done. I mean, you may believe that's how it was done, but I don't see any evidence that that's how it was done.
Well, my perspective here is that
Sorry, did you really say as he remembers it?
Yes.
You have to keep in mind a few things when you're talking about the Gospels. One of being, of course, things like Markian priority, which is recognized by almost all biblical scholars. You're talking less than 10%, and 10% is being really generous that actually challenge that. Now you have Mark, of course, it ends where it did, but in addition to Mark, there's also the hypothetical Q document, for which there's no actual evidence that it really exists. The only thing we have is the assumption that there's word of mouth that these stories must have come from somewhere other than being fabricated out of whole cloth. So the other 3 Gospels are regarded to have been based upon the Q document in addition to Mark. So you have Mark plus whatever this hypothetical Q might have had in it, if it ever truly existed. I mean, all we have is word of mouth that as the assumption that there must have been some kind of gospel. And that's really all we have pertaining to that.
Yeah.
But each of these Gospels, they were written hundreds of years after the fact. These weren't eyewitness accounts.
I don't know about hundreds of years, but they were written after the fact. Jesus instructs his disciples not to bring anything with them. That includes paper and pen. Okay, there was no type.
The earliest Gospels were written about 115 years after his death, and even that's pushing it. I mean, you do have some early scraps of Mark, like P54, I believe it is, that they think might have been P52. It was that some people have tried to date back to what was it, like 60 years or something like that after the fact.
68 or something like that.
Yeah,
but I mean, even then, you're talking you're talking a generation later at that point. And
that's not a problem for an ancient text.
But actually, it kind of is, dude.
That's not a problem for an ancient text. Compare that to Livy or Caesar. History of Rome, Livy, history of Rome. Compare that to Plato, or that's not a problem for an ancient text. 60 years is remarkable. I take 60 years over 1,000-year gap.
Actually, for an ancient text, you look at some of the other stuff that was written about Caesar. He actually had people that traveled with him that were scribes that would record his deeds at the time. Now,
right, so they were recording deeds at...
I was going to say some of these deeds were, of course, exaggerated later after the fact, but nonetheless, you had the scribes that went with him.
That's fine. That still doesn't deal with the time gap from the earliest manuscript from the actual events.
But which is
the Bible has. The Bible has more bibliographic support than any of those texts, perhaps combined, as far as the earliest manuscript found and the date where these events happened.
Manuscript we have is circa 300.
4th century, yeah.
Yeah, it's between 300 and 400.
There aren't any originals.
There aren't any originals for any ancient text. Okay, what I'm saying is that the time gap.
There's the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those go back a bit further.
Well, I'm talking about New Testament here.
No, I know. I recognize Dead Sea Scrolls aren't New Testament. I'm just saying that there are indeed ancient texts that go back further. And unfortunately, some of that has to do with lovely tendencies we had back in the day, like burning the Library of Alexandria. Now, there's a loss for you.
Okay, so we would assume, because Paul is writing in 52 or 55, scholars say, we know that for certain. Now, we would assume then that the Gospels, in whatever form, had already been circulated, because Paul is writing what he was taught.
A lot of scholars agree that Paul's writings actually precede the Gospel. That's actually a fairly common notion among scholars.
Who are you reading? Elaine Pagel? Of course she says that. She also thinks that Paul was a Gnostic. Okay, so...
Paul clearly was not a Gnostic. He spoke out against Gnostics.
Well, that's what
Mark Ehrman is one of about a dozen that have actually looked into in terms of what their views on this are. But regardless...
Okay, well, when was the New Testament written? When would you say it was written?
Oh, shit, hang on, my lighter. I need to find a lighter that works. When was the New Testament written?
Yeah.
We can't give a precise date on it. We don't necessarily know, but what scholars do agree on is that Mark was written first, and then you had the hypothetical Q document, and then along came the other Gospels, which were based and drew from those two sources.
I thought Paul was writing first. Maybe Paul was Q.
Will you let me finish my statement, please?
Okay.
Okay. Paul could be Q, incidentally. I'll get to that in a second, though. Now, in terms of the writing of it, so you have the hypothetical Q document for which we have no actual evidence of what might have or might not have been in it. That we just don't have any scraps or anything. There's nothing left of Q. Q is assumed to have been word of mouth. So when Paul was talking about if an angel from heaven above preaches a gospel unto you other than that which we have spoken unto you, let them be an anathema. Most likely they were talking about something that would be essentially your Q kind of document there. It wasn't actually written down, but was a gospel just shared amongst them, spoken word.
I agree. The earliest form of the Gospels was an oral tradition. I'm not denying that. I believe that when they had enough time, when they were able to get away from those who were pursuing them, they didn't have a publishing company. If they did, it would have been torn down, right? It would have been burnt down into the day they built.
I mean, what you're talking about is essentially once they could get somebody that was a scribe that was willing to write it down for them.
Yeah, I believe that what was going on under the persecution. But these, I don't have any doubt what they wrote, even if it was 50 to 100 AD. I have no doubt that what they experienced, they remembered every detail. I have no doubt about that.
Okay, first off, they wrote down what who experienced.
When they dictated to whoever wrote it down, might have been a scribe. They might have hired somebody. Mark might have been a scribe himself.
Okay, I'm going to challenge that.
No, please.
Okay. Sermon on the Mount. Okay. Do you think Jesus had a stenographer with him?
No.
No. So now, if I was to list 20 different items, have you ever, I don't know if you have the kind of game show in the US where, you've got a bunch of things that go past and you got to remember, and if you remember them, you get them. So it's like the fluffy toy and the, the coffee maker and, this, that, and the other. Okay. People don't remember half of the things. It takes a lot to remember a list of things. Okay. So how do you know that anything Jesus said at the Sermon on the Mount is exactly what he said at the Sermon on the Mount? You're talking about a long speech that may have been, an hour long. Let's just round it off to an hour. Do you think every word of what he said will have been remembered by all those people without error?
Verbatim, no. But let me. But the essence, yes. Let me address the talk show. I think you're oversimplifying this whole thing here. This is not
oratory tradition, isn't it? Obviously.
Okay. Well, let me just say this. Let me just say this about the oral tradition.
Yeah.
This was something that they did not take lightly. If you read the Bible, you could tell that it's written in a way towards memorization, learning towards memorization. There's mnemonics. Mnemonics is still the best way to teach. I use mnemonics. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. The Bible is filled with these types of memory devices. Did you know that there were 10 generations before the flood and 10 after the flood? You think Moses did that? You think there was exactly 10, not 11, not 9? Or you think Moses had another purpose? He's teaching towards memory.
That memory teaching kind of thing that you're talking about, that would have been Old Testament. That would really not carry forward.
These are Jews.
That far past Babylon.
Tradition. It's the same tradition.
I would think
these are Jews. Matthew was a Jew. Matthew gives us the letters of King David in his genealogy. If you read the genealogy of Matthew, it corresponds to the Hebrew letters, the 4 letters of David. So there is mnemonics, there is memorization. This was very important. This is how they learned. We today can't memorize anything.
If I may, I made a point of not contesting that as far as the Old Testament goes. Once you start getting into the new, once they were under Greece and Rome, those traditions have mostly fallen away.
That's not true. That's not true. Matthew was a Jew. He kept the same. I just told you that
didn't say David he wasn't a Jew. I did not say he was a Jew. I'm saying that oral tradition had mostly fallen away by that point, because this is where writing was starting to become more popular. For that matter, at that time period, every Jew, after reaching a certain age, males, mind you, were required to actually copy the Torah, jot and tittle, every jot and tittle.
You still had to memorize. It still was you still memorized it, and they still used the same methods.
No, actually, part of the memorization of it was the writing of it. It's that transcribing. It's like when you write something down to remember it. They'd gone to a different system by that point, dude.
You still had mnemonics. I just showed you. David separated the genealogies found in Matthew, 14 and 3 sets of 14. This is not done unintentionally. This is done on purpose, so that even if you don't have enough money to afford a scribe, it wasn't easy to get a scribe. You had to have some dough.
No. The Jewish people of that time period didn't actually hire scribes. They did it themselves. They were required to. It was part of their religious practice, dude.
Oh, not every.
What was hard to get was the paper.
When you got up and you spoke the word, it's still designed from memory learning. Not everybody is going to get a scribe and write it down. So you still had those mnemonics built in.
Their religious teachings to actually write it down themselves.
Not everybody wrote it down, dude. I'm telling you, it wasn't. Scribes were very expensive back then. This was not something you would do on a Sunday night and then send it to the publisher Monday morning.
This is why Hebrew still exists today, because they were required at the time to learn it and to write it and transcribe the book. They were required to make their own copy of the Torah.
I'm not denying when they got the writing. I'm not denying that they wrote it, but they still also use memory devices, and we see them in the New Testament. So they kept that tradition of using memory devices to help us remember the facts or the truths that God wants us to know. I can go through.
I've heard a lot of lectures that are saying that that claim is a myth, but anyway, continue. It's not that important in the end.
Well, did David not break down his genealogy in 3 groups of 14? Did he not do that? Do you think that was a coincidence? That it just so happens to correspond to the letters, the Hebrew letters in David's name? You think that was a coincidence, or you think he did that on purpose for memorization purposes?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily relevant to the conversation. I think we've kind of gone off topic.
All right, well, let's bring it back in. Let's go back to the evidence of the Bible, and as far as it being not reliable, because I guess that's where you're asserting.
Well, I've got another.
Because it wasn't written right after the fact.
I've got a contradiction, which is a P or not P type one, I think, and that is in the book of Titus. Which is, can God give a solution to a paradox? Because this is a paradox. If Cretans are always liars, then it's a contradiction. Because if the guy is a Cretan saying that Cretans are always liars. So if the Cretan saying this is
I think you can write that one off as hyperbole, honestly, Cliff.
Yeah.
Well, what verse is this in? Is this in Titus 1?
Titus 1, verse 12.
Cretans are all hey, I'm sorry, I've seen that word before.
This is
always liars. They usually use that for us, for Christians, right? Or is it cretards, right?
No. That's not cretards or anything like that. That's
right.
That's Cretans, like when they referred to somebody calling them a Cretan in Monsters Inc.
Yeah. In this case, it's someone from Crete.
Yeah. Cretan.
So
okay.
In this case,
Gentile, probably.
It's the prophet from Crete.
Right.
You can see one of them, a prophet of their own.
Yeah.
Said Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons.
Well,
so I mean, if we're going to go into a syllogism for this, premise 1, it's a contradiction to give a definite contradiction to a paradox. Proposition 2 is Titus here is giving a liar's paradox with the definite solution. It is true. See right here, part 13. This testimony is true.
He'd be calling himself a liar, in other words.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you're saying that you always lie, then you'd be telling the truth and saying that. But there's your paradox.
Yeah. That is a contradiction. It's a liar's paradox.
I don't see that as a contradiction. All right, let me.
Don't.
Oh man, you should have gone with hyperbole. We would have given you that one.
Yeah,
I don't see what hyperbole. Hold on, let me ask you a question. What one of them, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons.
Yeah.
This testimony is true. Right. Therefore, rebuke them sharply. Why is that a contradiction?
Because if look at it, a prophet of their own, meaning the prophet is a Cretan.
Yeah.
So if the Cretans are always liars, then the prophet is lying.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
They're always liars. And if this testimony is true, then it's a paradox. It can't be true and not true at the same time. That is a contradiction. That is a not P.
I think that this is more of a even your people say that you're a liar.
What?
I think it's more of the author saying even your people think that your own people are liars. I don't think it's
paradox.
Yeah, I don't see but I see what you're saying here, and that can be, if you want to take that and make that into a contradiction, that's fine. I don't have a problem with somebody saying even your prophet says that your people are liars.
Okay, so could you agree now that there are contradictions in the Bible?
I don't see that as a contradiction. I see that as more as an attack on the particular people. Now, if you want to call that a contradiction,
okay, Jesus Lord, if you don't mind for a second.
Yeah.
Can I help you out just a little bit on this one?
Sure.
There's an answer that you might want to just write down somewhere or keep in the back of your head, which is that it might be seem contradictory, but it's not theologically important or theologically significant.
No, I wouldn't say. I would say it's not significant to theology, but I would say it's not a contradiction. I think it's more of.
Yeah, definitely it is though, because here's a person saying that I'm always lying, and then you're saying that that's a true testimony that he's always lying. And if he's always lying, how can he be telling the truth? This is the paradox we're talking about. It might be contradictory. It's not theologically important, so who cares?
Yeah, but you're taking this and trying to turn it into, I think, something more than what the author was trying to communicate. I've said this before. Now, if I was contradicting myself by saying that your prophet, even your own prophet, says that y'all are liars,
if the prophet,
that to me.
Okay, but if the prophet is also a Cretan, if he's also from Crete and saying that people from Crete are always liars, then the Cretan is either lying or he's not lying when it says it's true. I mean, it can't both be true at the same time. The Cretans can't always be liar, because he is a prophet from Crete and is telling the truth.
Actually, laws of logic you could also use to counter this one.
Yeah.
Because in the same way kind of thing.
Yes.
At the same time, in the same way, because he could be saying they're all liars, but not mean that he's actively lying at the time, or that they're lying always, but they're all liars. There's a little difference there.
Yeah, I think
they're all lies, not always. Oh no, it does say always. Always is a bad choice of words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's more. What's going on here is more of sort of like a part of a whole type of thing. I don't think that this is something you could try to make stand on all fours. I think he's speaking in sort of a poetic type of thing. He's using metaphors, calling them beasts. They're not literal beasts. The Bible does use this type of, if you want to call it hyperbole, that's fine. It does use this type of language. I don't know if I would pin this as a contradiction, an author contradicting himself within the same sentence. I just find that hard to believe. It's not theologically significant, but it's also absurd to suggest that an author would contradict himself within the same sentence. Now, he might have, if you want to examine that with a magnifying glass, I guess you can come up with, that doesn't make any sense. But a lot of times when we speak, we say things. I say things like that all the time. People, your people are liars. They always don't tell the atheists are liars. They never tell the truth. Even Drag said that all atheists were liars. I mean, if you want to hang your hat on that, that's fine.
But there's a difference here, isn't it? And that is that you're happy to accept that you're speaking in a hyperbole, except for in this case, you're saying that the Bible is accurate. It is inerrant. Well, it can't be errant and inerrant at the same time.
I guess there's just some lazy verses and lazy language in the book here and there.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, I think
13 gave you a perfectly good out, which was hyperbole, but you don't want to seize upon that.
I think what's going on here is sort of you know, what's called part of a whole speech. He's targeting a particular prophet and saying that this prophet is false. But all doesn't always mean all. Okay,
Well,
always doesn't always mean always. I'm sure there were certain people in the town who were not beasts and behaving like this and behaving like animals or lazy gluttons. And
right, so
this is an attack on the prophet rather than the entire.
If I may, the way that this section strikes me is more that the author was more focused on attacking this other group than actually being careful in his language.
Which is
I mean, we do it all the time. We do it all the time. I mean, we make statements like this. We're really targeting a certain group who are speaking out. Everyone in the Cretan land is not prophesying, so he can't be talking about all of the prophecies or prophets or people because all of them are not prophets. He's targeting a specific group of Cretans, probably the leaders. Probably the ones who are in charge and abusing people and are evil, like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and those types of groups. When Jesus says the Jews, when the Bible says the Jews, it's not talking about Rabbi Schneider. It's not talking about...
It's talking in a broad sweeping generalization.
Right. Well, it was written to a particular people at a particular time. The Bible was written for us, not to us. Now, somebody reading this back then would know, he. Now, it still may be hyperbole, like you said, but the person reading it back then would know exactly what he was talking about. It would not seem like a contradiction to them.
But would you? I mean, you're not going to.
It's still a logical contradiction, and that's really the only issue here.
The proposition.
Yeah. Sorry.
You know, it's proposing a claim and a solution, and the two can't be true at the same time.
Because not in the same way.
Yeah, it's the law of identity, isn't it? It's breaking the law of identity. It's a logical contradiction in terms of the proposition. That the prophet is saying, who is a Cretan, is saying Cretans are always liars, and then the bit in green, this testimony is true. It can't be true if the Cretan is saying it because Cretans are always liars. So, like I say, in terms of the proposition, it is a contradiction.
Well, the prophet of their own said this. Okay, so it wasn't thus saith the Lord. The prophet said this. So what the prophet is doing is the prophet is wrong. I'm sure the prophet is wrong. Cretans are not always liars and evil beasts.
Well, the quote Cretans always lie, you're as evil beasts is being attributed to the prophet that's Cretan. This testimony is true would have been the author of Titus, who he might have written a book in there. I don't think he was necessarily a prophet.
Okay, well, the testimony is true. And like I said, this is not for an author to contradict himself within the span of a sentence. To me, I mean, you could read anything and find stuff like that, where someone says that all black people are this or all black people are that, and even their leaders say that all black people are lazy. If you say that in a particular context, those people listening to you understand what you're saying. Now, somebody reading that's not in the same room with you, that doesn't know who you're referring to specifically, of course they're going to be offended.
Just 1 second. Cliff, screen share yourself, please. You're not showing out on the external, I don't think. Either that or Brian's just not paying enough attention. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's...
Oh, wait, never mind. Brian's just not paying enough attention.
Yeah,
I don't see any contradiction here, but...
Well, like I say, it can't be true if Cretans are always liars. If he's a Cretan and he's not, if he's, You know, he can't be lying and not lying at the same time. If he's a Cretan, then he's always lying because it says this testimony is true. But he can't, you know, he can't be, he can't be telling the truth that Cretans are always liars when he's a Cretan and he's telling the truth. The word always makes it a certainty position. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I don't think that. I don't think that's what I don't. I just don't see this as a contradiction.
You have a couple more?
I mean,
I think it might be time to move on to another one if you have another one.
Yeah. I mean, it comes down to you know, for me the resurrection accounts. You know, again.
Yeah. Well, it's just, on the Cretans. I just simply think that this is a general characterization of people. I don't see, you know, how a general statement like this is, you know, contradictory. I just don't.
Well,
yeah, I think the much bigger problem is that end of the gospel with the women telling nothing, saying nothing to anyone. I think that's a bigger issue because those later gospels that tagged more onto it. Now, whether this had been initially expanded in Q or not is highly questionable. But then there's the other fact, which is there were, what, like 200 different Gospels at the time? Mm-hmm. And the additional 3 other than Mark that were added in there were just kind of chosen by committee as which ones would actually get included. And part of that had to do with things like popularity among the people and this and that. But it's kind of problematic anyway around it because we don't know how these other gospels actually went or if they agreed at all with the ones that we still do have copies of. Well, and unfortunately, when they kind of went that way, most of the other gospels were later destroyed in later centuries as time went on.
But not only that, I mean, you know, if we look at, you know, the New Testament, there was a massive kind of schism at the time when they were, you know, whether they were going to put in Revelation. Because, you know, Revelation is nothing more than a dream. It's not, you know, the church history. It's not about the stories, you know, of things, you know, it's not the letters of Paul. It's some guy's dream.
I don't know, man. I think the thing that I'd be more concerned with, I'm sorry if I'm turning this into a little bit of a discussion with me and Cliff for the moment, and I promise to try to keep this short. One of my concerns is with, you know, roughly 200 different gospels that once existed back there that they found references to, what you end up really with Markian priority and knowing that Mark was first, and then there's the hypothetical Q, you end up with basically Mark and a whole bunch of fan fiction, and 3 of the fan fiction gospels were included, and that's kind of sketchy, we'll just say. Yeah,
I mean, like I say, for me, it comes down to this end of, you know, this end of Mark. You know, that if Mark is the gospel that everyone has elaborated on, which is what the scriptural critics say. You know, these are the people that are versed in this and have studied this. You know, they've studied the style of writing. Because at 13, I know you know this, I can never remember which, but there's 2 of the Gospels were certainly written by the same author, is the belief. I can't
I'm not familiar with that, actually. I don't think I don't know that that's the case. The thing that always struck me about Mark, though, is that where it ends, it always struck me like there should have been a second volume that was never actually written, and that I always thought was kind of sad because I wondered what that volume would have contained.
Yeah, Mark does definitely end abruptly. I mean, I think we mentioned that earlier.
It's kind of like he wrote book 1 but never wrote book 2.
But like,
maybe he was lost.
But this is the problem. You know, it's you know, from the scriptural critics, it's a matter of historical record that the early manuscripts of Mark stop at Mark 8, and the Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century is an example of that. And then everything else has been added later. So the long ending of the Gospel of Mark, which is all this extra stuff underneath, all this stuff down here, you know, that doesn't exist. It's been added to later. Now, why would they have added that later? You know, you know, it's almost like a conspiracy theory here. You know, it's like, well, you know, they must have had to add on the new other versions because they realised that there's no eyewitnesses. It's, you know, the Goonies one where, well, wait a minute, if One-Eye Willie killed all his men, how did the story get out?
I don't know about that, man. I mean, the thing is, if you look at the style of the writing, it also radically changes at that point, which is why a lot of the scholars think that some scribe said it can't end there, and then just basically reference the others to try to add more to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was going. I think that's most likely what happened. It's an abrupt ending. They have several manuscripts that they're trying to compile the story together. And this might have been a manuscript that was much newer.
What you end up with is a forgery at the end there, though, being added on there that's based upon these, 200 other gospels somewhere.
I don't like it in particular. I read the end of Mark and I get chills.
But when you get to the other three gospels that are based on Mark and this hypothetical Q, which we know nothing about Q, honestly, then how can you even necessarily say much of anything about this resurrection account when all you have is the women ran away and you're waiting for the sequel to be written?
Well, you're assuming that Mark was the first gospel.
No, I'm referencing that Markian priority is recognized by the vast majority of scholars. I'd say over 90%, but I don't have an actual number. The only person in our community online here that actually disagrees with that would be Max, and he and I have fought over it, and even he acknowledges that the vast preponderance of both evidence as well as scholars agree that Markian higher priorities there.
Was the first gospel written?
Yeah,
not the first gospel story told. So I think the oral tradition was carried as soon as actually scholars have traced the oral tradition found in 1 Corinthians 15 back to a mere decade after the resurrection. So I think the scholar...
I'm sorry, I'm curious. How did they trace an oral tradition if it's not written down?
It was an oral tradition. It was a psalm that they sung in the church. That they sung in the first century church. Before Paul was writing. That's why Paul says, I give to you what was passed down to me. So this was passed down to Paul from someone else before Paul.
But that makes sense. You said
it does make sense.
No.
It makes sense.
Hang on. You said that an oral tradition was what was the phrase 13?
Was circulating before anything was written down. I believe that they told stories.
How did they trace it? You said that was the word you used, traced. They traced it. Well, how can you trace an oral tradition?
Well, there are hymns that people were singing.
That wasn't the that's not what I asked.
Okay, hang on. Wait. So did they know what the name of the hymn was and they saw in writings the name of the hymn referenced or something?
Well, I haven't done much research on how they found that this was a tradition that went back to...
Yeah, that's what I was curious about, because I'm thinking if it's an oral tradition, whether it's a hymn or what have you, how the heck did they know it was practice unless there was reference to it and we know what it was at the time, and then it wouldn't be oral. There'd be written record of it. And that's what I'm curious about.
It may have been written, but we don't have any records. We know that a lot of the records were destroyed in the temple destruction of Jerusalem. So it might have been in a creed. It was the first creed, we believe. We called it the first Christian creed, long before there were any of the Athanasius and all of the other creeds that came much later. This scholars suggest might have been a creed that was passed around in whatever form.
Okay, is this an individual scholar or a group of scholars, or I'm wondering where this came from.
Yeah.
So that I can look into it.
I have to. Yeah, you could look into. Might have been Paul Meyer. Might have been Paul Meyer. Check him out on that.
Okay. Is there anyone else that agrees with him on this, or is this just one guy?
You'd have to look at that up yourself. I do remember Paul Meyer. I do remember reading him.
Meyer.
Meier.
Meier. Okay, thank you very much. I'll look into that later.
Yeah. This is a creed that was developed later in church history. So we have the creed that they later developed during church history. This is before the Apostles' Creed, and all of those creeds that we have, that were the famous ones.
Finding the Historical Jesus, is that his book?
Yeah, Paul Meyer. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just something. It's just something they believed, and they sung hymns. I'm sure. I mean, they cited verses from the Old Testament, of course, Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema. They still did those things, even though it was New Testament. I don't see why they would stop. And then when these events happen, I don't see why they would not pass down what they now believed or what just happened. I mean, that I don't see a problem with scholars concluding that they did that. If Paul is saying that it was passed down to him, then it had to exist before Paul, right? 1 Corinthians 15 was written in the 50s. So if he's saying it was passed down, or he received it from someone else, then we're looking at 40s, maybe 30s, 40s. Jesus was crucified in 33, 36 AD, right? We're looking about 15 to 20 years. There's no time for any type of legendary corruption, I don't think.
Well, these things happen all the time. I mean, mistakes get made.
Well, I don't see any mistake here. What do you mean mistake?
Well, what I mean is that someone says something, someone else says something, and the message doesn't get translated completely.
You mean like Chinese telephone?
Yeah.
No, I don't think that's what's going on with Scripture here. The last game you can compare the transmission of the text to is Chinese telephone. For one, in Chinese telephone, there's only one line of transmission. In the transmission of the New Testament, there are several in different areas of the world.
And this might be why we had over 200 Gospels at one point.
And this is why we have over 6,000 copies of the New Testament.
I do want to point out something, and I know it's not really relevant, but it does make me chuckle. The end of Mark, the added on bits makes me chuckle, because there are the 5 bits. So you got the Great Commission bit, but this does make me chuckle. Let me change the color just to show the lols of it. So, and these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons, speak in new tongues, pick up snakes with their hands, and drink deadly poison, it won't hurt them, place their hands on sick people, and they'll get well. Now, it's the bit that makes me chuckle is, if you look at it, you've got, the people, the religious people who, like, they strike out demons, and, you see these... the charismatic ones. Do you know what I mean? Your Benny Hinn type characters. So you got those, and then you've got the speaking new tongues, and like you get loads of people who do that. It makes no sense. There's no sense in it at all. It's been, it's been analysed, and there's no grammar, no syntax, nothing. It's just nonsense.
I'm wondering why we're bringing up a known scribal inclusion here, something that's a known forgery that was added in later. Now, granted, also was then copied and transcribed into later and later editions, and stuck because this is what happens when you have official scribes.
Yeah, I'm on the lols.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So pick up the snakes with their hands. Well, there's your snake handlers, and then the last one is heal. There's the spiritual healers. But weirdly, have you ever noticed that there aren't a great big dearth of people that do the whole handling, drinking poison? It's amazing how many people don't have enough faith to do that. They'll have faith to do all the other ones, but they don't have enough faith to do that.
There are plenty enough to pretend to.
Neither do I.
It's a long thing. I find that amusing.
I do too. I don't have enough faith to pick up a snake. Not even a garden snake.
Yeah. But, you know, like I say, it just makes me chuckle. It really makes me chuckle.
Well, I mean, even I've seen some suggest that this was fulfilled, even though it might have been a scribal edition. The text doesn't implicitly tell you to pick up a snake to test God.
Okay, I think this is a scribal edition that I don't think there should be any theological problem with just ignoring this one, to throw this one out. It's like, okay, no, it's a scribal edition, fuck that.
Yeah,
there are two others that are a huge problem, but this one here I think you can just throw out easy.
Yeah, I'm not trying to represent it as a contradiction or anything. It's just kind of like, you know, it's something that I noted and thought, you know, it's amazing how people try all the other four, don't get the people drinking poison to demonstrate how faithful they are to God, whatever, you know. Because of course, occasionally you'll hear the snake handlers, and some guy got killed because he was handling a snake with some religious ceremony, and he ended up dead. You know,
the two stories that are additions that I find most troubling are the adulterous woman and the Good Samaritan. Yeah. Now, granted, if you're going to claim that it's inspired by God, I'm more than happy to say, yeah, sure, maybe the scribe was inspired and that's why he added them, but the fact they weren't original bothers me a little bit because they are my favorite stories.
Yeah, I was sad to hear about those stories not being the originals either, but that's okay. I think the scribes had good intentions with the Samaritan story. It might have happened. They might have found some extant manuscript that had it that we don't have today. I have no problem with the teaching or the the concepts that are taught there are completely biblical, but not the ending of Mark.
So if a scribe comes along and adds something in from another text, you don't have a problem with that then?
No, because we have 6,000 manuscripts to compare. The science of textual criticism will take care of that. That's how we know Tom Jefferson's Bible is false.
Yeah, none of which are alike.
None of which what?
None of which are alike. 9,000 copies, none of which are exactly alike.
No copy is exactly the same. They all don't make the same errors, however. So by comparing copy to copy, scholars have been able to get back to the mother copy, or at least as close to the original as you're going to get.
Which is 4 cents.
Well, this is kind of where the problem with the whole inerrant notion comes in, though, is if you have a text and errant scribe decides, well, I like this story, I'm going to slip it in there, and then it gets copied and copied and copied into later versions and becomes part of the narrative over the long arc of time, who's to say that there weren't other things that were smuggled in there too? So at that point, can you truly say it's inerrant or simply say it's inspired?
Yeah, no, you say something like that, and that's fine. Say inerrant, and we haven't got an original to compare it to. Well, how can you make the claim? How can you make a certainty claim on something like that?
Well, it's inerrant in the sense that the concepts, the teachings are optimal. It's inherently good.
You're not saying that it's inerrant in terms of the literal words on their page as they're written, then?
No, there are minor errors like spelling and grammar, but
entire stories being added.
And there are scribal additions, yes, but that is not the Bible. When we say the Bible, we mean the mother copy. Now we don't have the mother copy, right?
So how do you know there's a difference between the mother copy and the earliest one we've got, which is the 4th century Codex Sinaiticus?
Incidentally, the Codex Sinaiticus is not the only early complete copy we have. There are a total of 4 technically, including Vaticanus, which is the latest of the group, which has, well, frankly, the most added stuff to it, we'll just say.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's actually, and of the Sinaiticus and the other ones, Sinaiticus is considered to be slightly earlier, but they mostly agree on things. So that's the closest you're going to get to a mother copy.
Yeah, but they generally agree on things, but they've all got different bits and different bits added.
Well, part of that's just screw ups, like the whole kicking at the prick being on the wrong page.
Yeah.
Well, where it mentions taking it the freaking axe, that's actually not original. That was actually transcribed from a different section in there because the scribe apparently lost his place while copying it.
Yeah, that happens. I would refer you to textual critics like Bart Ehrman, who even admits that what we have in the Gospels, it represents what they actually taught and believed in the first century. Not verbatim. They didn't have a tape recorder, but the essence has been captured, and what we have today is what thus saith the Lord. There's not much doubt about that.
So you don't argue against Ehrman, then? That's cool.
No, not when he says that the errors. Ehrman has two types of scholarship books. He has books for the sensationalists, and then he has books that are more scholarly. When he says that there are a billion errors before you could read, or in one page there are so many errors, or more errors than words, I think he said.
No, there are. Well,
that's sensational.
Manuscripts. No. But it's also true. But most of them are. Well, hang on. Wait, please. But most of those errors aren't important. They're not significant.
Right. Yeah. He admitted that.
It's a letter difference or what have you. Yeah.
Yeah. He admitted that in his debate with Dr. James White. That 99%, I think, of those errors, quote unquote, were grammar and spelling. Yeah. There wasn't much as far as legendary errors.
Well, there were some other fun stuff too, like lines being written in twice in some of the editions and what have you, because they lost where they were on the page and this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
actually,
that's
when I was working on my book, I screwed up and pasted to the wrong point and had like 3 fucking chapters repeating. It was horrible.
Yeah, I mean, God could have wrote it himself, but he trusted us humans to do it. So, yeah, that's going to happen. But I think the goal was to get the message out, and the message has gone out, and it's an accurate. The King James, I have no problem with. I'm not a King James only, but I have no problem with the King James. It's a transliteration, but it's fine. You can get yourself a concordance and learn how to read the Bible with the King James. I have no problem with the new books or the new translations. They're fine. They're more of a they're not more of a word for word, so more of like a thought for thought translation. I like the New Living Translation. I was able to read the Bible cover to cover. I would suggest any atheist that wants to learn how to read the Bible.
I've got a kind of weird question for you, just because it's what's on Cliff's screen right now.
Well, let me just say this. That's the New Living Translation, not the New World Translation. The New World Translation is wrong. Okay, go ahead.
Actually, I think that's the New King James up there, which I think for these kind of presentations is usually better to use just because anyone that's out in the audience will have an easier time understanding it because it's more plain English. Yeah. But regardless of that.
A lot of people don't realize that the King James Bible is it's actually surrounded in a lot of political problems. But not only that, it's written in a pseudo 15th century English that people didn't use at the time. If you don't believe me, you compare the King James Bible and Shakespeare. Now, yes, Shakespeare is flowery language because it's a play generally, but if you compare the style of the writing, they are completely different styles. People didn't speak didn't use the King James Bible style at the time it was written.
Actually, can I just really quick respond to something Jungle Jargon said in the external? You're absolutely right. Ancient texts do not have English grammar, which is why we know that the Book of Mormon is crap. Sorry, go ahead.
I actually had an amusing part with that when so I pointed out, my resurrection contradictions thing I mentioned earlier, and it was Shamos where I said, like, in one version, the Matthew version, where an angel swoops out of the sky and pushes a tombstone out of the way, and he said that didn't happen. And so rather than accept that, when I demonstrated it on the screen and read it out, he decided, no, you have to look at the Greek. And so went to the Greek, and then he tried saying, well, look, there's a hyphen there. It's like, there weren't any hyphens in Greek. It's just the letters. There wasn't any grammar involved in there as such.
There weren't spaces between letters, for crying out loud.
Yeah, so like I say, it was comical. But this is another one I think is a contradiction. So when did the fig tree hear of its doom? So in Matthew here, it happens after the purging of the temple. So this is the cleaning of the temple. And it's basically where you've got people selling birds of offering, and Jesus is like, how dare you overcharge people for a cleansing thing. And it's like, he just upset the tables and all that kind of stuff. This is unacceptable. Now this happens before the fig tree. Look, Jesus cleanses the temple, the fig tree withered. And then in Mark, it's the fig tree withered, Jesus cleanses the temple. Which one's true?
Whoa, wait a minute. You're gonna have to back up. I'm sorry.
Okay. Here we go, look.
Let's go back.
Yep, this is Matthew. Jesus cleanses the temple.
All right. We understand. We're still messing with the synoptics here. I thought I was clear on what the synoptics were and what their intentions. I don't think they intended to do this, but when we put them all together,
the order's not true.
Okay, so what's your contradiction here again?
One happens before the other. Is the tree, is the fig tree, I don't know, you call it cursed? Does Jesus curse the tree before cleansing the temple, or is the temple cleansed out, before? Which is the true one?
I haven't heard. I'm not familiar with that apparent contradiction, but I promise you I'll look into it. I don't see. I haven't studied that one. I've never heard that one before.
Mm-hmm. The other part is that when did it wither? Did it wither immediately? Because in the Matthew one, immediately the fig tree withered away. I'll just change the color of it so it shows out. So immediately the fig tree withered away. And then when we look at Mark,
it was the next morning, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Cleanse it before the morning after. Jesus cursed the fig tree. Notice it had withered, and it was later on. This was the next day kind of stuff. The next morning. Where is it? There you go. There's the tree that's withered later. So this is when he curses the tree. Then he cleanses the temple, and then, oh look, the fig tree has withered away. So it's after the temple. So we've got this version here where you've got the cleansing of the temple, and then the fig tree withers immediately. And this version where it's all disappeared. Where he curses the tree, and then they see that it's withered away. Are those not contradictions? Hello?
Remember what I said about some things not being theologically significant? Or claiming that the author might have misremembered something or what have you. I mean, there's funny ways to try to dodge this one that are actually fairly safe, I think.
Yeah.
The only thing is, if you're claiming that it's perfect text, that's where the only place where you really have a problem here.
And this is the problem,
I mean, you have to allow for human error, and if you don't, then that's where you have some of these problems.
Yeah, it tends to happen with with the biblical inerrantists. This is where I see the problem. When you've got people who say, look, for example, I had this disagreement with a Christian anarchist who is making a certainty claim about whether there are contradictions. He says there are no contradictions in there, and I asked him later. I said, after at least an hour of going through these contradictions, and he was like, and I said, have you actually read it all yet? And he said, no.
I mean, the Gospels don't even agree on when the Last Supper was.
Okay, well, like I said, I haven't done my research, but I was able to find an article written by an apologist who I like to watch, Matt Slick. If you want me to read his explanation for this apparent contradiction, I can.
Matt Slick will turn cartwheels to do that. That guy is incredibly dishonest.
Okay, all right. Well, there is an explanation if you want to hear it. If not, then you can continue to believe.
May I ask how long it is?
It's only about a couple sentences. He just
go for it
said,
then. Yeah, if it's a couple sentences, go for it.
Sentences is fine.
And it doesn't appear as though it appears as though he believes this is a problem also, and that there are several solutions. He says possible solutions. One answer I've discovered is that Matthew is writing thematically, where he often groups together without a detailed focus on chronology. Now, this is exactly what I said earlier. Matthew doesn't always write in chronological order. Matthew is more of a poet. Mark is more of, let's get the information out. Mark is the Reader's Digest. Matthew is the novel. Okay. And then he adds in all types of, theological themes and Jewish stuff in there. He's got genealogies and he's got that ordered, and as I mentioned earlier, in a particular pattern. So Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience. So he may not use the same type of writing style as Mark. As a matter of fact, they don't. So Matthew simply compressed the event. I'm reading from carm.org, which is the website. Matthew simply compressed the event to a single instance in order to make the point about the necessity of bearing fruit. Matthew's account is not meant to be chronological, but thematic. Mark's account presents the chronological order. That's a possible solution.
Yeah, but that's saying that some of the authors just added stuff in to fit their narrative, doesn't it? When you think about it?
Or it could be saying that Mark wrote the way he wrote because he was writing to a particular audience. And that's the style of writing that Matthew wrote in. I could write a novel about 9/11. You can write a novel about 9/11, and it could be totally different styles. You can use chronological order. I could use more of a poetic type of format where I'm not necessarily giving you in chronological order. I'm giving you a hierarchy. Maybe I'm giving you what's more important to me first.
I'm not even challenging you on this. What I'm saying is, in what Slick said there, isn't he saying that one of these authors added into it to suit better to their audience?
Well, they're not adding anything to the text.
This would be akin to when preachers started going into some areas of Africa where they didn't have sheep. They had to change the whole sheep thing to pigs because that's what was valued there. You have to tailor to your audience, but in doing so, there are certain changes that happen that can, to fit one culture, really kind of alienate another or really shift meanings of things.
Well, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so, because all he's doing here is writing in a thematic or poetic type of format. I could tell a story about 9/11 and start out with the plane, with the buildings collapsing. That's not what happened chronologically, but I'm writing in a thematic, poetic type of way. As a matter of fact, most movies, if you're a movie buff like myself, they may start you out with a flashback of what happened in the middle of the movie chronologically. Yeah, so I think that's more what Matthew is doing here, rather than adding to the text.
That might be a slightly better defense. However, I actually, with these particular bits regarding the fig tree, I've always had a little bit of problem with the author on this. Because if the author intended this Jesus character to be seen as being God and having divine power and what have you, why did he curse the tree to death? Why didn't he just make it blossom? That's the one thing about that section. As far as writer's choices go, I wonder why the writer chose to go that way with it. Because wouldn't it have been more interesting to have him actually have the tree bear fruit at his command?
Well, that's what Jesus did, and I think that's a theological road that I don't know if we want to go down. But the tree represents.
I'm sorry, I wasn't actually getting into the theology of it, more so the choices of the authors.
Yeah, it's just a tree. Another one will grow back. Don't worry. Don't climb any fig trees and say you're not coming down until Jesus until Jesus blesses this tree. All right.
But there are a lot of things in there
the curse
of choices made by the author that I find somewhat troubling, and that's just one of them. Because I think that if he wanted a fig, he could have got a fig if he was God, kind of thing. But at the same point,
that's what Jesus did. That's what he chose to do. So they're just recording what he did. They're witnesses.
I don't see it that way. I see this as a book that was written. But in any case, there are other areas which are much more problematic because there are third-person accounts of Jesus. Like, for example, the Garden of Gethsemane. That's highly problematic because who would have even been able to record it? The rest of the apostles were supposed to be somewhere else asleep.
Yeah.
Well,
so who wrote it? Who was there to know what happened? Other than the Romans, that is. And Jesus himself.
Perhaps this information was given to Jesus. We don't have any details of how that information was got into the minds of the apostles, or
you mean given to the people that wrote the Gospels? You mean?
Well, that's
the apostles, yeah.
I mean that's one of the other problems that I see in one of the resurrection aspects, and that is the disciples were warned that the resurrection would happen, but they didn't get the parable. This this is in Luke 18, and John 20 is the one where they didn't get it. But the Pharisees knew about the resurrection prophecy, but they were the only ones to believe it and take it seriously. So the Pharisees who didn't believe it was true took it seriously enough to put guards on, at the tomb, even though they didn't believe it was true.
Well, they didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah, that's for sure. Or they didn't want to believe he was Messiah. I think some of them did believe.
Well, I don't know. If you look at what they believed their prophecies were for the Messiah, the closest person they've had to it was Simon Bar Kokhba. But the thing is, what their view of the prophecy was and what later Christians came to think of as being their prophecy are very, very radically different things. Which is why Jews tend not to convert so much.
Yeah. Well, the 12 disciples were Jews. They converted.
I don't think all
not
of them
all
were.
12, but one.
Yeah, a couple of them were. Yeah,
of course. Yeah, well, they were Jews. Matthew was a Jew, so I have no problem with Jews not believing. That proves nothing.
And a fair number of them were members of apocalyptic cults as well.
A fair number of who?
A fair number of the apostles also would have been members of apocalyptic cults that existed at the time as well. The whole apocalypticist movement at the time?
They were.
A fair number of them.
There were several movements, I'm sure.
He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. Sorry.
Yeah, like Brian. There we go.
There's several. John talks about these movements. And he even says that some of these movements have infiltrated the church, the true church. So yeah, we know that Satan was at work and during those times trying to confuse people, which he's still doing today.
Dude, I really don't think you can necessarily put that on Satan. I think we're just talking basic human nature.
There's another contradiction that I see, and this is I don't know if you remember about the Gentile that shows her faith. So
The Gentile shows.
yeah, so it's Mark 15, Matthew 15. Sorry. So there's a woman from Canaan, you know, and she shows her faith. That's short version. Okay.
Is this Old Testament?
Sorry.
Is this Old or New Testament?
New Testament.
No, it's Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, why the hell are they talking about Canaan? That makes no sense. When was this supposed to have happened?
Well, Canaan is people still
It's
live
a
in
bit
the land.
about the unwashed hands thing, you know. But anyways,
But as a nation, Canaan had been gone for ages by then.
Yeah.
No, that's not true.
well,
That's not true.
but here's the thing. Okay, in this version, she's from Canaan, and yet in this version, she's Greek.
Now, the Greek one would have made more sense. I think Canaan might have just been a scribe screwing up.
Yeah. Canaan could mean a number of different nations surrounding Israel. All of that was considered the land of Canaan. So we have the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the
Canaanites would have been long gone. But if you're saying land of Canaan, those lands by this point, after the conquest of Egypt, would have been under Greco-Roman influence.
Probably, but it was still called the land of Canaan.
Might have been, I don't know.
So those surrounding nations that we would consider the Middle East or Syria, those nations were still considered the land of Canaan, even in the New Testament.
No, if the author of that one was of Jewish tradition, then that's a possibility. But it still is technically on the surface a contradiction. Now, once again, not theologically significant, or you could claim that it's a difference in the authorship and how they were regarding the area, but on the surface, it's certainly a contradiction.
Now, here's a question for you. Can someone pray in public? Because, Jesus in Matthew 6, I think it was, said, don't do it. You should go into the closet and, pray quietly to, whereas Paul encourages it in public in 1 Timothy, I think it was.
Wait, is it 1st or 2nd Timothy that's the one that's considered not to actually have been Paul?
I'm not sure.
Can we double check that? My hands aren't working well today.
Sorry, where were we looking?
One of the two Timothys is not considered to have actually been written by Paul. I can't remember which one. I'm pretty sure it's one of the Timothys is highly contested as most likely not actually having been written by Paul. There's actually a list of them. I don't remember them offhand, but there's a number of the Pauline letters that are considered not to have actually been written or penned by Paul. I think one of the Timothys is on the list. I think it might be 2nd Timothy.
I'm just looking at oh, sorry. I thought I was still screen sharing. This is I'm using Wikipedia because it's just the easiest.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure one of the Timothys is one of the books that's contested.
Here we go. Some modern scholars argue that 2 Timothy wasn't written by Paul, but an anonymous follower after Paul's death in the 1st century.
Okay, so is that quote from Paul 1 or Paul 2? Sorry, Timothy 1 or Timothy 2?
It's 1st.
Oh, okay. Never mind then.
Let me.
Thank you for looking that up for me.
Yeah.
Well, liberal scholars say both 1st and 2nd were written not by Paul, but
well, the majority of what's regarded as a gospel is actually just the writing of Paul anyway, or unless you only regard the actual gospels as gospel, and it kind of casts off the Pauline letters as just being Paul's thoughts on the gospels.
Yeah, I see the Synoptics as one account from 3 perspectives, and then you have the Pauline letters.
But you consider them to simply be his opinions on the faith, or do you consider them to be actual gospel?
No, Paul is all Scripture is inspired, breathed of God. So Paul was speaking under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. What he says is His Bible is God's word. You have a problem with Paul, I assume.
Oh, yes, I do.
Oh, who doesn't?
Well, would you like me to give you a little bit of it? Now, this is mostly my opinion, but I'd be more than willing to let you know what my problem is with them.
Well, can I just go through this one first?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I think you wanted to.
Yeah. So this is
prayer.
Yeah. So this is Jesus. When you pray, go into your room, shut the door, pray to your Father in a secret place. You know.
This is what chapter?
This is Matthew 6.
Okay, Matthew 6, right. Okay, I see it. Okay.
Yeah. Do you want me to make it a bit bigger on the screen? Does that help?
Oh, no, you're fine. I can see it.
Okay. And then if we look at 1 Timothy, you know, pray everywhere. So Paul is effectively contradicting Jesus.
No, he's really not in that instance. As much as I hate to defend Paul, he's really not in that instance. Because there's a difference between what they're talking about there, which is just praying, and that can be quietly to yourself without anyone even knowing you're praying, versus the other one where they're talking about people that go out and make a big display out of praying in public to try to draw attention to themselves, where it's saying don't be like the Pharisees and Sadducees.
Like Benny Hinn.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen the Benny Hinn Street Fighter video?
I like the bodies hit the floor one better.
Oh yeah, bodies hit the floor. That's the classic. Yeah,
I prefer the Street Fighter one. That just makes me chuckle, and it's the noises that go in with it as well. You know, the and stuff like that.
Yeah, Jesus commands us not to do that. You know, some people walk around. You know, they're fasting, and everyone has to know it. You know, they tithe. You know, they gave $500 in the tithe, and they have to let everyone know it. No, we're not supposed to behave in that fashion.
And that's really what that first one is talking about. So yeah, I've got to keep everybody honest on this one because that one's really not necessarily a contradiction. As much as I'd love to sit there and step on Paul's face some more.
I must admit, I do find it funny when I hear the likes of G-Man try to use Paul to trump Jesus. So it's like, well, Paul says, and 1 Corinthians says this, and so says that, and it's like that's Paul, that's not Jesus.
I wish he'd go to Corinthians. It's like 90% Romans. It's like that's the only book he's read. Good grief.
Well, Paul teaches essentially the same thing Jesus teaches. Jesus taught repentance. We know that. John the Baptist said, "He that comes after I will baptize you with water and unto repentance, and baptize you with water and fire."
I thought it was baptize you with the Holy Spirit, but okay.
Right. Paul teaches applied repentance. Okay, how does this work in my everyday life? He's actually writing letters to the churches of Asia. So he's responding to their letters. You can tell he's responding in some of his epistles because he says in response to, or this is to deal with this situation.
Pretty much all of those letters are written to specific audiences, specific places, specific times because of specific circumstances going on.
Right.
And many of them aren't meant to be taken out of those specific places and times and circumstances.
Romans 1 is one that annoys me because when I get Christians saying, God exists because Romans says everyone knows God exists, that's bullshit.
Because when he's using everyone in that particular context, he's talking about everyone that's a member of that church.
Yeah, he's speaking to the church in Rome. And of course, the people in the church in Rome all know that God exists. In fact, what he's effectively doing is saying, look, he's rebuking them for not living a holy lifestyle.
He wasn't talking about, for example, Australian Aborigines.
Yeah, or people in the Amazon.
Yeah.
That had no idea that any of this stuff was going on. And, it's nonsense. And obviously, from my perspective, I don't know God exists.
Well, I don't see Paul's missions or Paul's mission or his letters as only applying to the Church of Rome or the Church of Ephesus or Colossian. The Bible was written to them, but it's written for us. So anything he tells them is for us today.
Well, no, he's for the people of the church, because he's writing to the people of the church.
Right, and we are people of the church today.
I'm not in the church.
No, you're not.
Yeah, so when he's saying everybody knows God exists, he's not talking about me.
Yes, he is.
I don't know God exists.
Yes, you do.
Okay, please demonstrate that I know God exists.
I don't know enough about you, but I can.
No, how can you possibly say that I know something? We're talking about Gnosticism now, okay? Not belief. We're talking about Gnosticism.
So, are you agnostic? Do you consider yourself agnostic, or not knowing, or are you an atheist? Are you?
Almost everyone that's an atheist identifies as some form of agnostic atheist. I'm one of the exceptions because I generally hang agnostic over my head just for the sake of convenience, but in reality, it's not accurate. I'm actually Gnostic in my belief that there are no gods.
Well, the only consistent atheist is a nihilist, in my opinion.
I don't see how that follows.
But that's just my opinion. But I would say God exists because of the world that you're in.
That doesn't...
Can you explain what you even mean by that?
Yeah.
The world that we live in, you can look up in the sky and see that this was not all an accident. So that's what Psalms says: "The heavens and the earth declare the glory of God." It's saying that you can tell.
It's all physics. It's not an accident. Physics isn't an accident, so to speak. Physics does what physics does.
Where did physics come from?
Physics is a description of what we see. It is it is describing the world that exists.
What we see, where did it come from? You have no answers for origin. So I think that's what
you don't
Paul
have
is saying.
Origin. You just
okay. No. What you have is a post hoc answer for origin. It's something that somebody made up thousands of years ago, and I don't see why we should sit there and put any relevance into that kind of a claim, because I could make up 100 different origin stories along the fly. Now, the nearest we can tell, Big Bang seems to be the closest thing we have to a good, solid explanation, and it's been tested, and it looks pretty darn good. But at the same point, in terms of these kind of narratives, I mean, you can come up with anything. Now, even if you're to try and propose that this is the word of some divine entity to try to communicate it to humanity, the assumption that humanity would properly understand, God can't come down and explain quantum physics or just basic physics during that time period. They didn't have the scaffolding of knowledge yet. So the best he could do is kind of show them, and then they can try to record what they were shown. And at that point, there's all kinds of errors that are going to get in, because at that point, it's down to the interpretations of the person that were shown these truths.
Okay.
Now, I mean, I look at it in a different way, because this is my belief of the whole religion thing. Okay? Because I think that some early hunter-gatherers, this is a hypothesis kind of an idea, okay? So some hunter-gatherers, they've done their hunter-gathering for the day, and they're around a campfire, and they're philosophizing for the first time. They're looking up at the stars and saying, where does all that come from? They're looking at the trees, where did that come from? And where did we come from kind of thing? Where does the wind come from? What makes the trees move like that? And one of them picks up a leaf and blows it and said, well, I blew this, and it moved. Maybe there's a giant man, like us, but a giant man that blows, and that's where all the wind from all the world comes from. It's
some of the early gods were structured just like that.
Exactly. Effectively, God is made in man's image, not the other way around. And it's logical. It's wrong, but it's logical. And the idea of Thor throwing the lightning bolts, down, or Zeus,
God
kind of ideology behind it. And so I think that all this God stuff, is like, Adam meaning of the earth kind of thing, the dirt, ashes to ashes, dust to dust kind of analogy, is, sort of some, one of these hunter-gatherers, and he gets a stick and he draws the shape of a person, or he gets some clay and puts it together, and look, I made this out of the earth. Maybe that's how we came about. You know,
And we actually saw a lot of parallelisms amongst other cultures when they were first coming up with their God notions and what have you. For example, Native Americans have the Great Spirit, and then they have all the spirits that rule over the different classifications of animals, so to speak.
yeah.
Yeah, like you have a coyote, for example, as their trickster, and so forth.
What's the there's a word for it, and I can't think what it's called. It's that there's a spirit made of clay, and I can't think it's called. It's like a living being.
I've been trying to remember it. I can't. There's a lot of words not forming in my brain right now.
Yeah, we're both thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
That's the same idea. That's where the Adam idea comes from. And as far as I'm concerned, the whole religion thing is, the core of the onion is, that sort of this makes sense, trying to create analogies to, make sense of the world, because they didn't have physics, and they didn't have chemistry, and they didn't have biology, and they didn't have the ability to answer these big questions. So, in the same manner that, 98% of statistics are made up on the spot, including the one I just gave you,
well, Cliff, let me ask, Cliff.
Hang on, let me just finish off. That effectively, in the absence of being able to answer these questions, that, they basically made something up, and everything else on top of that, which is, dogma and costumes and tradition and, all that kind of stuff, the religion that makes up the rest of it. It's
easier to explain things, especially to children, by telling stories.
Well, yeah. Well, let me ask Cliff. So would you consider that?
Don't ask me. I don't like being axed with. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. That was.
And Shadow, I guess you could chime in if you want, but would you consider that those people of the ancients, would you consider them to be ignorant?
Yes.
Because okay, Paul.
They didn't have the ability to answer these questions.
Hang on a second. In this, I just wanted to insert here that in this case, we're not using ignorant as a necessary pejorative.
No.
Yeah,
no, of course not.
Ignorance of the realities of the world. I mean, just to give you an example, until was it Galileo? Basically, until someone made a telescope, we had no ability to look at things that were far away. Until someone made a microscope, we weren't able to look at the very small. So, you can't. The idea of what was it that they thought cholera or the Black Death or whatever, was there was something wrong with the water, or what was it? I can't remember now. But it's the idea of they didn't realize that there was something, there was something wrong with the water, at a microscopic level. So in their ignorance, they had to make something up to fill in the hole of what they didn't know.
So this is basically sort of you're arguing the God of the gaps theory. Is that what
No. What we're talking about is there was a time period during which you really didn't have the tools to properly explore our world to try to figure some of these things out. Yes, this is back when we looked up at the skies and saw signs and portents.
So they said God did it, basically.
Yeah, kind of. I mean,
Yeah, that's the God of the gaps, right?
The stars, constellation.
Yeah, it essentially is the God of the gaps, yes.
Yeah,
okay. Well, I would agree with you about all of those ancient civilizations, but not the Bible.
Oh, special pleading.
Okay. No, not special pleading, special reading. Okay. Paul writes in Acts 17, if you allow me to read this. Okay. Now, the Bible is the spiritual book. All right. So it's not dealing with all of the astrological or the inventions that we have in the 21st. Right.
We do acknowledge that it claims to be a. We do acknowledge that it does claim to be a spiritual book. Feel free to go.
So it's not attempting to deal with those types of phenomenon or natural phenomenon, like the ancients or the some of the groups from Mesopotamia and the Babylonian. They all sought to. They had what we would call fertility cults. They all sought to figure the world out based on nature. Okay, and then they, of course, assigned a bunch of capricious, moody gods to those natural phenomena. That's not what we have in Scripture. Okay,
Well,
and Scripture starts off.
The real departure is that it's monotheistic instead of polytheistic.
In addition to being monotheistic, it also does not have those types of God gaps that need to be filled in. So God is said in the Scripture to be the creator of everything.
They have one God filling every gap instead of individual gods filling smaller gaps. That's the difference.
Okay.
I mean,
it's still technically filling the gaps of the God notion, dude.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Ten Commandments, the first commandment is "You shall have no other gods than me." And, but it doesn't say there are no other gods, and yet that is the Christian position now. And what a lot of
Is that a contradiction?
Well, it's
no, actually, it's a lot of people regard it as just signs of the evolution of the faith that initially started off growing out of polytheism into monotheism.
Yeah, it is the shift between between polytheism and monotheism. Effectively, the way the society worked at the time was that, remember, these are the Israelites. They're wandering through the desert at the time. Okay, and so the way the culture worked at the time, throughout the region, is as you went through one country, which was basically just the territory another tribe controlled at the time, which is whether it's the Canaanites or the Hittites or whoever. So as you traveled through between their ones, you prayed to their local god. You basically paid your dues to the local god to say, okay, I'm gonna pray to your god to honor you for being nice people, and we stay with you for a couple of days, then we move on, kind of thing.
The gods of any nation you came across were regarded as being real gods as well, but you were never to put them above Yahweh, is what it comes down to.
Well, effectively what happened was when Moses goes up the mountain, comes down with the Ten Commandments, he gets pissed off because they're praying to the golden calf, which is the local god of that area. And so he's like saying, for crying out loud, I go up the mountain, come back with a tablet, and you're praying to an iPhone. What the hell's this?
And they're going, dude, you're up there for what, 30 days, was it? Good grief, man. We thought you were dead.
Yeah. But, the idea is that, we have one God that goes with us wherever we go.
Man, not accurate.
We don't pray to the local God anymore. We now have our God. We only pray to our God now. Wherever we go, we don't do that old stuff before. That's gone. We are now
not accurate. Sabella just brought something up in the external that might want to be touched on. Asherah, my Asherah. Initially, Yahweh had a female counterpart.
Ah.
Oh boy! All right. Well, let me just say this about the whole polytheistic, monotheistic. The Bible tells a story, a meta-narrative. So you have to read it from the beginning. In the beginning, the Bible claims this was not the case. Okay, and then if you start to read Genesis, is a really long book. I didn't realize Genesis was that long until I actually sat down and read the entire, or listened to it on audio.
Oh man, it's what, like 50% begats, for crying out loud?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. To fast forward some of it.
I have read all of the Bible, but I do kind of glaze over when it's so and so begat so and so begat so.
Oh, that's it.
Well, yeah. Well, let me say this now. Now, what you have here is that Abraham, after generations of this worship, which began in this polytheistic worship, where God fell in the garden, he fell into perpetual sin and separation. So as he became further and further separated from God, he began to replace God with false gods, God of the moon, God of the sun. You have the Egyptian gods. You have 10 Egyptian gods.
The problem is anthropology shows it's the other way around.
What do you mean it's the other way around? I mean, I'm not talking about surviving or extant text. I'm talking about
I'm talking what we know of anthropology. Religion went the opposite direction with them. Is that it started off with many gods and then went down to the one, and this whole thing of then they started falling.
Let me finish. Let me finish.
Way, that's all. I was just making a small point.
That's not what anthropology teaches. Anthropology doesn't teach what the first man and woman believed. Okay, you can find civilizations, Mesopotamia, of course. That's
Well, that's what
ancient
anthropology
Babylon, of
studies.
course. Well, that's the first civilization. That's not the first man. So the Bible tells the story of the first family, of the first man and the first woman. And then after they sinned, humanity fell into perpetual sin. Okay, and then you have whole civilizations that anthropology can go behind and excavate and find out information about these Molech and all of these false gods. God then decides at a certain point in time when he got good and ready to do it, and he can move when he feels like he's moving, when wants to move, because he's God. So don't say, "Oh, why
Okay,
did he wait?"
I can try to help.
He called Abraham out of the pagan land, out of the false teaching, out of polytheistic, back to him. So that's the story of the Bible. Is the Bible is telling us a story about how God is reconciling us back to him, away from the worship of the iPhone, back to him.
You have some huge problems that you don't even seem to realize that you have.
What's that?
Now, granted, anthropology does show that the worship of multiple gods came before. Now, if you're going if I may, please, just let me finish this up.
Okay.
Now, if you're going to say that Adam and Eve were specially created by Yahweh for a certain purpose, and they went forward and had all these things, that's fine. But the problem that you have is early populations within societies, because there's no way, unless Noah's wife had a Gatling cannon shooting out babies for a womb, there's no way that you could get these kind of populations in ancient Egypt and Assyria and what have you. It's just not possible. What you're almost better off with is looking at the Genesis account, where it first says that he created man. He's talking about mankind, and then later created these special people. That might be avenue of apologetics you might want to look into. That's all.
Well, sure. What you're doing is you're taking the story of the Bible and you're making assumptions that I never made. I didn't tell you when the first man and woman lived.
No. I'm offering you some alternatives to the reader that might help. That's all.
What is the alternative other than the first man and the first woman worshiping God alone? What other alternative is there? You're going to show me anthropology. Anthropology can only tell me what the first civilization did.
I'm not talking anthropology at this point. What I'm saying is that if you look at the Genesis account, where in Genesis 1, where it says it created man, that'd be mankind, but then he created these special people, which might have been the first of the people created, but you're talking mankind was created, so you end up with this larger population that can then beget independently of this special group of people that's come from the two.
I've heard that sort of pre-Adamite type of theory. I don't buy into it.
Well, they could be parallel.
Adam was the first man, and Eve.
It doesn't have be. It can be they were created at the same time, but these who are special.
Well, are you consider these pre-Adamite creatures to be subhuman?
Well, I don't consider any of the story to be actually real. It's just these are other apologetic techniques I've heard that might help. That's all.
No, I don't. I go off what the scripture says. It says that Adam and Eve were created special creations of God. They were special because they were the crown jewel of his creation.
This was in Genesis 2 after it already said that he created man in Genesis 1.
Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 have two different purposes, but that's another debate. I don't want to get
I won't argue against you on that, but I agree they have different purposes.
Yeah, they have different purposes. Genesis 1 is
matter of fact, if you go by the multi-author hypothesis, they were written by two different authors as well. I mean, Genesis 1 is a priestly voice, and Genesis 2 is regarded as being the Yahwist, also known as Jay, and Jay's honestly my favorite author. Jay's great.
We believe that Moses wrote both Genesis 1 and 2.
Well, I would have to point out that, from the Adam and Eve story, God created sin, wanted it to happen.
What's wrong with that?
Well, God doesn't want sin, but made sin happen.
I don't know. I think the bigger problem is the whole claiming that death didn't enter the world until he ate the fruit because then why was the whole freak out over the tree of life then?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, as far as I'm concerned, Adam and Eve were set up to fail. God, you know, God set them up to fail.
Okay. Well, that's fine if that's what you want to believe, but
you don't think that's true? I think I can illustrate it.
Well, I think that God created the potential for evil, for sin.
Well, he wanted sin to enter the world.
He wanted sin to enter the world.
Absolutely.
He wanted to create a world where freedom of choice was possible.
But he wanted...
And anywhere we...
He intended sin to enter the world.
Well, if he intended for...
If he did not intend... In a sense, yes, because if he did not want sin to enter the world, he would have created a utopia, which is what I guess we're trying to do now.
But if he wanted sin to enter the world, why did he get so angry when they ate the fruit?
Yeah, it makes no sense. I mean,
they disobeyed him.
Yeah, but he knew they would disobey them. You know,
that's fine.
This is why, you know, I mean, effectively, God is a trickster God, according to this, according to the Adam and Eve story in Genesis 1.
A fairy trickster, actually.
Well, if I place...
Let me go through the list so I can explain what I mean. Okay, so he creates the garden. He creates, the tree of knowledge. He creates fruit that must not be eaten. He creates the serpent.
It's a tree of life in the same garden. Sorry, but yeah, go ahead.
He allows the serpent to speak, which is a weird thing for an animal to do. And he gave free will. Now, when you take all those factors, so what happens is he allows the serpent to twist, to corrupt effectively, Eve, to persuade, to tell her, no, you won't die. You'll get knowledge. And so she persuades Adam to eat the fruit, and sin enters the world. Okay. Now, if God is omniscient, he knew before he even said, let there be light, the choice that they would make before they made it. Before he created them, before he created the fruit, the tree, the serpent, any of that stuff. Okay? He knew what they would do before it happened. So the only conclusion is that he wanted sin to enter the world. So he could punish them, then die for the sins.
Wait. Actually, let me reframe that just a little bit. He deliberately created a world in which sin would enter the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. He did that on purpose.
So he wanted to trick them. He intended to trick them. Don't eat.
Do you have kids?
Don't eat the fruit.
Cliff, do you have children?
No, I don't.
I do, okay. But you know what? If I sit there and put a whole big old bowl of candy in front of them and tell them not to eat any, they're going, and I know darn right well they're going to eat some of it, and I'm not going to get angry at them because I'm dumb enough to put it in front of them.
Yeah, because hang on. Just use 13. Shadows.
Not a reasonable expectation, man.
Yeah, not only is it a reasonable expectation, but you still have. The get out clause, and you don't actually know what they're going to do. They could actually pay attention to what you said and not do it. So you're not really setting them up. You're probably setting them up, but you don't know.
Probably.
Whereas God, if God is omniscient, he knew what they would do and then punished them, knowing what they would do, deliberately setting them up for it. That's slimy.
Well, there's a bigger problem too, which is that in accordance to the Bible itself, they didn't know good from evil at the time until they ate from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
Only at that point that they knew good from evil, so they didn't even understand right and wrong yet.
Yeah, I mean, you can't sin if it doesn't exist yet. It's like trying to explain, what a computer is from someone from the 1500s. It's like electricity. What is electricity? I mean, you're just talking gibberish to people who wouldn't understand that. So if something doesn't exist, how can they possibly know the difference, know what wrong is? You know,
right. They didn't know something existed.
You know, if I was to say, don't go through the mun, and you don't understand that mun is the Korean word for a door, and you walk through the door and I hit you with a big fine for it, that's not exactly fair, is it? You know, now at least, you know.
Let's go with not just instead of fair.
Yeah. It's not.
No, not fair. He was right.
Well, no,
You're right. It's not fair.
Just is the right one. You know,
not at all.
How do you justify that?
He could have stayed. It wasn't fair. He could have stayed by himself. He was God alone. He could have stayed alone. It wasn't fair. But
he deliberately made a world in which this would happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because he loves us. Now,
but he loves us, but says to fail. Seriously?
Your face right now, Cliff, is.
Well,
it's because it doesn't make sense. It really doesn't.
No, I mean
this is a lot. You said a lot.
This
man.
is.
And I don't know where to start.
But this is the reason why I don't believe, because this is contradictory to what God is supposed to be. You know.
Well, let me read to you what the scriptures say to sort of try to sum everything up here. Okay. Now we mentioned the worship of the false gods and the polytheism. Acts chapter 17 gives us an idea of what God is doing in the earth. Okay, it says that God overlooked people's ignorance. Now, again, we're not talking. People are not ignorant in the sense that they're, dumb or stupid. They just didn't know. But it says God looked over people. He overlooked people's ignorance about these things in earlier times. But now he commands everyone to repent of their sins and turn to him. Him, we mean Jesus. The text says, if you read the context, for he has set a day for judging the world with justice by the man he has appointed. And he approved to everyone who this is by raising him from the dead. So that's talking about Jesus. So, yes, there were men and families, there were whole civilizations that worshiped false gods. Yes, Adam ate of the tree, but he also provided a way for us to be reconciled to him. Now, again, he didn't have to create at all. He could have just stayed by himself. He was God all alone. Him, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Didn't have to. You didn't have to have any children, Shadow.
You're not.
You had children knowing that they would disobey you one day. But you still did it.
Well, I also had children with the goal of having them become better than I am over time. I didn't want children to be as good as me or less than me. I wanted children to be better than me. And this God character clearly doesn't have a similar goal.
No,
I mean, he deliberately made people so that they would fail.
I mean, in this case, as Shadow just said, he made Adam and Eve knowing that they would fail, knowing that they would sin, so that he could create. I mean, he had to create. He had to be behind sin, and yet God hates sin. Hang on, how can he hate sin and want it to come to an existence in the first place?
Well,
I don't know. Any logical issue here? Just wondering.
I don't see how we're in any position to complain. I'm not complaining. I'm happy he created this universe and put me in it. I'm just fine with that. He doesn't have to do a thing else. He could. I don't care what he does. I exist.
That sounds a rough.
Okay, so God does not have. He did not have to create. He doesn't owe us anything. I think the atheists and the agnostic sort of have a chip on their shoulder and believe that God owes you something because you exist.
I don't.
God doesn't owe you anything.
Well, I don't think a God could owe me anything because I don't think there are any.
Yeah, I don't believe the gods even exist to do anything of that nature.
Okay, but we're talking about the story of the Bible. Are we critiquing the story of the Bible or your personal beliefs?
Hang on for a moment here, if I may. Just hang on. Sci-fi moment, please. In my stories, there is a creature that created the universe. There actually is one. Now, he created it as a pocket dimension, and it took dozens of tries before he actually did it successfully. But he's not a god. So in this fictional universe, there's a creature that created a universe. It doesn't want people to worship it. It doesn't have some great divine plan. It's not omniscient. It just set things in motion. It's not a god, nor does it claim to be. Yet at the same point, you have this character in this that makes all these weird claims that just don't necessarily make any sense. But at the same point, you could assign it to anything. It doesn't really matter. I mean, you're just sitting there throwing that in. Well, this book, I'm going to take this to be real. So since this one thing claims to create us in this one book, I'm going to follow it. Well, you know, I have something that created everything in my book. I'm not going to arbitrarily follow that. I don't really see much of a distinction there.
Yeah, I mean, you were asserting that I've got a chip on my shoulder about your God, but from my perspective, your God doesn't exist. You know, I don't hate your God because I don't think your God exists for me to hate. I mean, I can think the character is flawed and contradictory, but I don't hate something I don't believe exists. You know, there's no structure behind it, if you know what I mean. It's just an idea, as opposed to, you know, well, it's no different than Voldemort, in my opinion, or the Hooded Claw, or Sauron, or whatever.
I didn't have children so that I could put them in a duel.
If I didn't intend to say that you hated God. What I mean by a chip, if I did come across that way, I apologize. But what I mean by a chip on their shoulder is that they believe, after reading the story of the God of the Bible, and after reading who he is, for anyone to say, well, why did he create all of this? To me, it's foolish. You wouldn't be here if he hadn't created. Okay, so
I don't believe that.
To answer your question, let me answer your question about why God created and included freedom of choice. Okay, not free will, but freedom of choice. God is the only one that has free will. Because without free will, love is rendered meaningless. Okay, if you got married and your wife told you that the only reason why she married you is because she was forced to, she was brainwashed into doing it, or she was programmed to do it, that's not love. Love has to come from a choice. And God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life.
Because he wanted mankind to love him.
Without choice, there is no such thing as love. And God is love.
And that whole love argument, I kind of like that up to a point, but then you run into some issues, which is, you know, he's then simply creating us because he wants to be loved ultimately.
Well, he created us for his glory. He does everything for himself, for his glory. Don't like it, create your own universe.
He created us because he wanted us to love him for his glory. Glory?
Just kind of pretty vain.
Narcissistic. Yes. And vain, yeah.
Yes, it is. If that's what you want to call it. You don't like it, create your own universe from nothing.
I already have.
You can't use God's dirt.
Well,
I already have, dude. I already have created my own universe from nothing, man. I write sci-fi.
You know, the irony of it is when you just said nothing, because that goes to something you were talking about earlier about the creation thing, or, well, you know, Big Bang kind of stuff. And it's like, and it does make me chuckle. I've heard Jungle Jargon. Hello, Jungles. I don't know if he's still in the side chat, but he was earlier.
Probably.
And he'll sort of say, "Oh, you can't get something from nothing." It's like, what is nothing? You know, because
according to Krauss, something is nothing, and nothing is something, according to Lawrence Krauss.
Well, I don't believe there was ever a nothing in the first place. You know, I don't believe
the universe
absolute nothing.
So you believe what Carl Sagan said, the universe is what it is and always will be what it is? Is that?
No, that's not necessarily the case. What you have to keep in mind is, on some levels, when you're talking about things prior to the universe, it's kind of like asking what was inside of the bubble before you blew it up.
Yeah, you know, the way I look at it is,
we can't speak as what the prior state was.
Yeah, the way I look at it is that, you know, energy and matter are transferable. You can change one into another. And I think there was just some bits of energy floating around in a vacuum. Now, obviously, you know, you have to create an idea of that, because before the Big Bang makes no sense at all. You know, because until you have that moment, and you know, and even then, use the word moment, you know, you have to create a new language effectively. But the singularity is the point before which there is no before. You know, because as soon as the singularity happens, that's when the past, the present, and the future.
Well, there's no before that we can actually look into or examine or explore. We don't know what prior states may have existed. There's no way for us to investigate that, because we'd effectively have to step outside of our own universe to do so.
Yeah.
And as near as we can tell, that can't be done.
Yeah.
And maybe someday in the future. But yeah, no time within the foreseeable, even sci-fi future will that be realistic.
Yeah.
Not even with any kind of weird speculative shit.
Yeah, and I'm not a physicist. I understand some concepts, but I don't understand all the details. I've never really studied science. But one of the concepts out there is the idea of the big bounce. Effectively, that you've got like a graphic equalizer with 6 knobs, and it's like the strong magnetic force and the weak magnetic force, and a bunch of other bits. And the idea is, if they're not perfectly tuned, then the universe wouldn't work. It wouldn't, continue to expand. It would collapse on its own gravity. It would fizzle out immediately. All sorts of things. But the idea of nothing is a concept that, we don't. It's a philosophical idea, and nothing more. An absolute nothing is nothing more than a philosophical concept.
We have no examples of a literal nothing.
Yeah, I mean, for example, I've heard people say, how do you get something from nothing? Well, or how do you get, this universe couldn't have happened on its own? Well, how do you know? What do you compare it with? We only have evidence of one universe. If there are a billion parallel universes, but we haven't got the ability to look into them yet, how do we know that any one of those didn't start off from nothing, as it were? We can only compare things when we have something to compare it to.
With a sample size of one, you can't say shit about it, really.
Exactly. It's like, well, from what we can see, we don't know. We hypothesize things, but to just assert that, well, you don't know, therefore God did it, which is pretty much what all the religion positions are.
Not all of them.
That's why I said
not all of them believe that God created from nothing, but most of them do have origin. They do have origin, or they do have God being a creator.
I just wanted to say that most of them do have some semblance of something existing before. Like, for example, what is it? The deep, I think, is referred to in the Bible as being the thing before.
No, the deep is created. The darkness is already.
What
created
verse says that he created that? What verse says that? It says he moved across the surface of the deep.
Well, it says in the beginning,
but did it say that he created?
That's after,
I don't remember that.
After Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So he's already created the universe, the time, space, and matter.
No, he's
already created that.
That's not what it actually says, though. It says he created the heavens and the earth, and then it says he moved across the surface of the deep, and yada yada yada. But it doesn't say that he created the deep. I mean, there was something there he was creating it out of. Is what I'm saying.
Well, in the beginning, God created. If you read it in the Hebrew, it's pretty interesting, because in the Hebrew it actually translates to time, space, and matter. Genesis 1:1.
I've heard that argument, but from the Jews I've spoken to, no, it doesn't.
Okay. Well, for them Jews I've spoken to, yes, it does.
No, okay. No. We seem to have some dissent then. Cool.
The heavens there would be considered would you say that would be considered the universe or space or outer space? There's your deep, right? The heavens, this doesn't include the sky, right? It's the heavens, it's the stars, it's the moon.
I don't know. That sounds like retconning to me.
Well, what does heavens mean there? What can it mean?
Well, heaven was considered to be a literal place, as was the earth.
No. He created the heavens and the earth. If you put that back up on the screen share,
but what did he create them out of?
It says heavens.
What did he create them out of?
That's plural. He created out of nothing.
Right. So
it doesn't actually say that. I'm just pointing that out.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Well, that's what we believe. The Bible begins with an axiom. We're not. I'm not going to sit here and say that I don't have faith. I believe a man.
Pointing out that that's as eisegetical as the notion that death didn't exist before the fall. So,
I never made that claim, but
yeah.
I'm just saying it's eisegetical to claim that there wasn't something that did already existed that he was creating things out of. That's eisegetical. That's all.
It says it starts off with an axiom. I can't assume that there was something before the beginning. Because then I would be eisegeting.
But when I listen to Jungle Jargon saying, "Oh, you think something came from nothing," actually, it's the Christians that believe this. I don't believe this. I think there was always a something. It wasn't a very much of a thing, it was just a bunch of energy floating in a vacuum, which is, we don't know what was there. I mean, that's the
where did the energy come from?
Where does it come from?
The energy?
Why does it need to come from something?
Well, nothing comes.
Actually, all I was getting to is it doesn't say in the beginning there was nothing and God out of nothing created. It just simply says that God created. It doesn't say what he created it out of. That's all. That's all I was going with that.
That's fine. That's an axiom. I admitted that. Yeah. I admitted that's an axiom. I have no problem with that.
Now, but you were saying,
my faith.
Where did the energy come from? Why did the energy have to come from something? Why couldn't it just have always existed?
That prior state.
Because nothing can create everything. Nothing ever could.
How do you know this?
Because I haven't seen it. Well, if you're a naturalist, then you better show me some evidence. Now, if you want to say it's a supernatural entity that did it, that's fine. Then we can make a distinction between who's right and wrong in other areas. But if you're telling me this is a natural phenomenon, you better show me some evidence.
Hang on, I'm going to.
We have evidence of energy, and we have evidence of matter.
I'm going to sneak in here for 1 second and derail this just a touch, if you'll let me. Because I've had like 5 different comments along the same lines here. And no, the whole making things out of clay thing, we're not referencing golems. There's no met thing here going on there. Now you could equate it to the golem, but the notion of, the clay people being made by the divine, that's slightly different than the golem notion.
Yeah, when I mentioned the golem thing, it was really the idea of, a bit like that, the mentality behind it as opposed to an actual golem.
Yeah, the actual notion of the golem comes from a golem that was supposed to be made back in the day. It's a legend that it was supposed to be protecting a village or something like this, and it had Emet written on its head, which meant life, and if you knock the E off, that's just Met, which is death. Anyway, yeah, that's a slightly different thing.
Anyway, so back to the...
Sorry about that. It's just, after getting a couple of them, I'm like, no, we're not talking about that one.
Yeah. It was the word I was searching for, though.
Oh, okay.
And again, it was an analogy as opposed to an actual golem for the reasons that a golem was created. It was just the idea of some people making something out of clay to represent people. I made this, clay figure that looks like a man. Maybe this is how we were made, and that's where the idea of, Adam being, made from the earth.
Sorry, anyway, back to the main topic here.
But, yeah, this idea of, well, you can't get something from nothing. I'm not saying that, I don't believe there was ever a nothing. These philosophical idea of a nothing of substance whatsoever, I don't think that ever has existed. I don't think it needs to be created. I think it just always existed. and that, like the seasons, that one can turn into another, and because the universe is cyclical. In the idea that stars, you have supernovas, which that's a star erupting, and then the material then creates other stars out of it over a long period, obviously. But the when you say it needs to be created, why would you say that?
Well, I think there has to be an explanation for natural phenomenon. If you're going to, I hear the atheists often say extraordinary, phenomenon needs extraordinary explanations.
Okay.
But yet you have this extraordinary natural phenomenon, but you don't know where it came from.
Hang on. Does energy exist?
So, yes, it does.
Does matter exist?
Right, but I'm asking you for origin. I'm not asking you for what already exists.
These are natural things, okay, that have been demonstrated.
Yes.
Okay, so where did the extraordinary claim come from?
The extraordinary claim, as you just made, was that this always existed. How do you know that?
Well, because
I also
it exists.
Where in the universe?
Hmm?
Let me ask you this: where in the universe does energy always exist?
Where, everywhere.
Can you demonstrate that?
Everywhere in the universe. It's all
energy exists.
Energy exists all over.
Energy is inexhaustible. It exists.
Well,
forever.
It's circular, isn't it? It doesn't get destroyed. It gets changed into something else. It gets changed into matter. Fire being an example.
So this energy is eternal. Is that your claim?
Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can merely change form.
Yeah.
Or I think that's quoted something like that.
And we have evidence of that. What we don't have evidence is a supernatural being creating everything out of nothing. That is breaking, basically Occam's razor. So how many assumptions did I make? I made one assumption, really, that, energy has always existed. We have evidence of this. Okay. That energy exists. Yeah. Okay. So that's my starting position on this, idea. So now, in order for your system to work, you have to have this super complex being that somehow came out of nothing, because if energy can't have always existed, then your God can't always have existed either, right?
Well, you say that energy always existed, but you can't prove that.
Okay, energy is really simple. A supreme being God is incredibly complicated. So if a simple thing doesn't need an awful lot of explanation, and a supreme, being certainly does need a lot of explanation.
Okay, Gil, can I kind of completely derail this, because I just remembered that this Hangout has a title.
Okay.
So, contradictions.
Yeah, you have one more contradiction for me.
I wanted to read this in for one moment,
like I said,
Go ahead.
Let me just say this: the Christian position we do have faith. It's not a blind faith, but we do have faith. But I think the atheist position is just as much faith is being practiced, especially when it comes to origin. Okay, all right, one more contradiction, and then I got to run.
Okay. I think we should have another conversation on this topic, because I think it's fun.
Oh, sure. Sure. You have my email.
And they're going, maybe that should be a separate talk, but it was all my thought. Anyway, just let's get back and wrap up the original, and that would be a good separate talk.
Yep. Okay. So 13. So heathens, you've got another contradiction, I'm guessing.
No, I was assuming that you had a couple more in your stable. I mean, I certainly do have many issues with the text and what have you, but I don't know. In terms of specific contradictions, I don't really have any off the top of my head because unfortunately I've lost most. I've kind of, after the last stroke, I core dumped most of that stuff, so most of it's like burned off of my mental hard drive.
Yeah, I've got one more. Okay, I've got another one. And it's the first Samuel 15. Now, you might be thinking, oh, I'm going to look at the Amalekites and stuff like that. And, this is a lot like Scarlet Fiction, he's done this. I was talking about this from before I knew him. But either way, it's like God speaks to, to Saul, sorry, to Samuel, who's the high priest, and tells Saul, go and kill everybody, kill everything, and, he doesn't do it. Basically, he keeps some of the animals, and captures Agag, who's the leader of the Amalekites. But there's a bit at the end. And let's ignore the idea that, why did God need an agent, need humans to do his dirty work for them? Why couldn't he click his metaphorical fingers and make them just drop dead or make them just vanish? He could have done that, but he decided to make people go and stab people through the belly and kill children and everything, But there's a little bit at the end of it. And it's this little bit here. So basically what happens is Saul doesn't do what he's told and he ends up being banished. Saul being the king of the Israelites. And it's this little bit here. And the Lord regretted that he'd made Saul king of Israel. If God is omniscient and he knows everything, then he knew what Saul would do. So why would he need to regret? Elsewhere it uses the word repent, but either way, why would God regret making Saul king if he already knew what he would do beforehand by being, by God being omniscient?
And mind you, going back to Noah's Ark, he also in that account also references that he regretted making man.
Yeah,
if I recall.
Yeah, but even though he knew what they would do and how it would turn out. I mean, the only choice here is either God is not omniscient and he didn't know, or he's inept.
Well, you could say that if you define the word repent the same way we might, even though we don't even use that word, that type of verbiage today.
I'm looking at the screen here. It's got regretted.
Regret, changing his mind. We do understand that these are heavenly realities, okay? And we do understand that men are writing and trying to teach us about these heavenly realities, sort of like a condescension.
Okay, so God didn't regret?
Well, sure he did.
Okay.
He regret making man, yes.
Okay.
He repented, yeah.
So he's not omniscient then?
Yes, he is omniscient, yes. He's all-knowing.
So why would he would something that he already knew was going to happen? That makes no sense.
And even more so, since you've already designated this as being a world that he intended to create with the outcomes that we've had.
Yeah. Heathens, you've created characters. Have any of them died? Did you regret it, knowing that in advance?
Well, again,
Yes,
I think you're taking the word repent or regret and interpreting it in a way that I don't believe the writers intended to communicate. Let me give you an illustration. Let me give you an illustration, because
hang on,
when the Bible talks about God repenting, it's not the same thing as you repenting. When the Bible says that God repented, he's talking about his behavior or his actions towards you because of your behavior. So it's sort of like if you're riding a bicycle, let's say you're riding a bike,
okay,
and you're riding against a wind, against whatever they call the storms nowadays. They have these names now that instead of just storm, it's a cyclone or something.
Okay.
So you're rebellious right now. You're rebellious in your position to God. The wind is blowing in your face. You're spitting in the wind, like the saying says.
Okay.
If you turn around, you are repentive. So all that means is that the way God sees you now is different. So it was the man that changed. It was man that sinned, and God repented that he made man.
Okay, so how does that relate to this verse, though?
Well, I think that the
It's
term
another
that's
instance of
being
the
used
same kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that the term there that's being used is the same type of deal. God knows the beginning from the end. We know that. When it says that God repented, it just means that you turned your bike around, or you may have turned it the wrong way. So God repented that he made you.
Yeah, it still doesn't help with Sodom and Gomorrah, though.
Sodom and Gomorrah?
Oh, yeah. God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and then he was negotiated with down to if he can only find one good man there. Well, why didn't he just decide that to begin with if he knew the outcome was going to be him being haggled down to one person?
Because okay, and I use this illustration because I don't want to get into the whole Arminian versus Calvinism, and because that's where it's going. That's where it always goes. They've been having that. They've been having that debate. They've been having that debate for hundreds of years. So we're not going to solve it tonight.
I got to ask.
We're not actually going into that. We're just questioning the omniscience.
Yeah, I do want to ask a quick question. Are you a Calvinist?
I would say I'm a biblicist.
Is that a no?
He's not firmly in either camp. Leave it at that.
Okay.
I'm a 4-point Calvinist, 4.5 point Calvinist. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So all right. Well, those who listening, who not theologians. I'm no theologian, but some of them say, well, you can't do that. You have to set all 5 points. Well, okay.
I have to say, I do find Calvinism. One thing that annoys me about Calvinism is it always comes across to me as a form of aristocratic Christianity. That only a certain people are elect. Everyone else is going to hell. But I think I'm one of the elect. Usually they won't say it, but you can tell that they think they are.
Well, that's what the Bible teaches. Now,
no. The point is that these people all think that they are specifically one of the elect without ever questioning it. That's the objection on that one.
Yeah, but not only that. I mean, it does say in the Bible that God is the judge of who is and who is not saved, and that on the day of judgment, you answer to Him. You don't, you're not pre-chosen. That's, I think that there is scripture that says the opposite. But then again, Bible does often end up being the big book of multiple choice, where someone could take one verse and take that application, and another one take that.
Okay.
One.
Anyway, back to God not to me to know things.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, that's like I said. This is going to take us down the Calvinism, Arminian thing, and the Bible does say He foreknew, and for those who He foreknew, He predestined. So, we can. That's a whole nother 4 hours of. Discussion, but
and an unresolvable pain in the neck, which has been argued over for hundreds of years. So.
Yeah, we're not gonna solve that one. Here's my theory. My theory is this, and this is just my belief. Okay?
And something, I just want to point out, I can appreciate someone saying that.
Yeah, because I don't think. I think I lean towards Calvinism more than I do the Arminian because it's more God-centered. But I look at it like this. God created a DVD, right? So He knows what's on the DVD.
Hang on. Sorry. Is God Japanese?
Oh, come on, man.
I'm sorry. I had to.
This CD is the universe. Okay, He's got the universe on this disc.
Mm-hmm.
He created it. He knows what's in it. He knows the beginning from the end. He knows what's going to happen. He puts it in and pushes play, and that's when the universe began. So when we say that God preordained these things, all we're saying is that He created a disc or a universe where all of these things were going to happen, and now it's just playing out for us today. So yes, he created that with the intent of saving us. But we have no problem with that. We have no problem because he did not have to put the disc in. He didn't even have to make the disc.
But why would he regret something that was on the disc when he knew?
That was part of the CD. That was part of the overall plan. It was already determined.
This is part of the weird issue we get into. I'm going to give you an example here. I'm going to give you, and I'm kind of appealing to emotion a little bit with this. So please, I'm just using this because it's the first thing that came to mind. But basically, that's essentially positing. Now, my niece, she's gotten better. She's fine now. The doctors did their job, but she had cancer in the hip at a very young age. My niece did, and what this would basically be stipulating is that God deliberately created a world in which that would happen. And that anyone who has been raped or killed or what have you deliberately created a world in which all these atrocities would happen. How does that reflect on the creator? If he deliberately created a world intending for these things to happen.
I told you this was going to get into. I told you we were going to get into this. And again, I just gave you my ideas. God is he's an enigma. I mean,
basically, the point is it kind of makes God seem like an ass.
Well, you could say that from your perspective in time when God has the whole CD. You could say that on track 15 at 2 minutes and 36 seconds when God has the entire CD. So he sees the beginning from the end.
I did say seems like, right? Just making sure.
If God killed Hitler as a baby, knowing what you know now, would you say that was immoral? Back then you would say that. If God came down and killed Hitler as a baby, you would say, you're immoral, God. You're bad.
No, instead he let him mass murder his chosen people. you know, as he's often joke, I wish he chose somebody else.
But today you wouldn't say that God was immoral for killing that baby back in 1920s, I guess he was born 40s.
32, I think, 34 is when World War II started. I don't know. So you go back 30 years from now.
Now, if God came down himself, and killed that baby, at that point in time in 1934, you and the mother would be crying and calling God immoral. Okay? But God sees the beginning from the end. So we learned as Christians, we've learned to trust God. Okay, because we don't have any reason not to trust him.
Okay. I have to say that on a personal level, not being a believer, I think that's kind of a nonsense argument. Yet, at the same point, I do appreciate you using a long arc of time argument.
Yeah, I mean, we don't see. You ever watch that movie, the Butterfly Effect?
Mm-hmm.
It was one of my wife's favorite movies. She watched it a few times. I don't like to watch movies more than once. But we don't understand what ripple effect these events are having. Thousands of years, 2,000s of years, 3,000s of years, 4,000, 10,000. Yes, I think the Earth is older than 6,000 years, if you were wondering. We don't see we don't see what God is doing. All we know is what's going on today. Sure, these things are uncomfortable. Earthquakes are uncomfortable, but are they necessary? Without an earthquake, you know what would happen to this planet, right? If we didn't have earthquakes, you know what would happen.
Well, okay, I'm going to give you a small thing. You'd be better off, instead of saying without earthquakes, saying without tectonic plates, which is what causes the earthquakes. That would make the argument a little stronger.
If we didn't have tectonic plates, this Earth would explode.
Yeah, not literally explode, but it couldn't exist as it is. We wouldn't have the seasons. We'd have a lot of issues. Land masses wouldn't be as they are, etc.
We'd be in a lot of trouble, basically. So God created a world. We don't know why he created a world like this. We don't know why he didn't create the utopia that that we want, that we try to vote for. But we know he's going to make it, and that he's going to make it perfect one day, and that's what we hope for as Christians.
Okay.
That
I really didn't. I really don't see you kind of get into the gritty about regretting, though. You know,
Can
well,
I chime in with one thing right quick? Because it's actually a question that you asked me earlier that I really quickly answered. When I create characters that I know I'm going to have to kill off, I don't regret creating them. I regret that I have to kill them off. I just thought I should be specific about that.
okay.
Especially because inevitably the characters I kill end up being my wife's favorite.
Well, is this a tragedy you're writing, or is this a love story?
No, characters die. People die. You know, it's in stories, people die.
Yeah. Effectively, it's the human equation, isn't it? You know, everybody dies eventually.
I write things a little bit differently than some people because I kind of have my universe and I kind of spin things up and plug the characters into them and see what happens.
Well, let me know when your book comes out.
They already are. There's a link.
Oh, okay. Yeah, send that to me. I'd be glad to.
And the cheat.
I'm a reader. I love reading.
Yeah, and
I don't really like sci-fi too much, but
well, it's a high fantasy story in a sci-fi setting.
Yeah, and how much are they on sale for? I can't remember. They're not very expensive.
The book one is like $2.99, but it ends with a vicious cliffhanger. That's well, hell, if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can get them for free. So.
You know what? That brings it up to a close because, of course, Jesus' Lord turns up and starts calling me cliffhanger.
Ah.
So, thank you for watching, everybody. We're going to finish off now, and I'm sure we'll have another conversation another time. And for the viewers that watched, I've had an average of about 27 at the moment. So thank you for watching. I appreciate your time. I'm sure if Talk Shit Tuesday had happened, apparently it didn't, I would have probably had 2. So thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day. And thank Shadow and
here's where I talk nonstop for a couple seconds. Make sure the stupid link at the bottom's on the screen because I have to whore the damn thing. Anyway.
Dear me. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Cliff, for having me.
No problem.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
God bless.